It was a bedroom in a large castle. The sun's rays came through the window, filling the room with light. On a dark background of bed linen lay a girl with a bare back and hair disheveled on the pillow. She was in a light slumber, and through the ghostly haze of a sleepy fog, she thought about how good she felt. Her hand rested on the elastic, muscular chest, and she smiled through her sleep and muttered that she loved men with wide chests. And at the same moment, her eyes opened wide. Man? She was confused. Who is this man with whom she was in the same bed? She shifted her gaze and looked up at the face of the man who was sleeping peacefully. The girl opened her mouth in amazement. A tall, broad-shouldered man was sleeping next to her. Golden strands of his hair fell onto his face. At that moment, the girl became desperate because she didn't remember who this charming, handsome guy was. And what was she doing in his bed? She urgently needed to remember what happened yesterday. She frantically reviewed the events of the previous evening and remembered that a masquerade ball was being held in the imperial palace in honor of her birthday. She stood in the hall of the palace and, noticing another guest, greeted him. The tall man glanced sideways at her. His face was covered with a golden mask with a red rose and a feather of the same color at his temple. Amethyst-colored eyes looked coldly. She remembered that there she met a divinely beautiful stranger. She began to be tormented by remorse. What the hell did she do? It's impossible right away on the day of her coming of age. She mentally asked her father to forgive her for this act. She sat up on the bed, covering her nakedness with the sheet, and at that moment, the man turned over on his stomach. The girl looked at him and was stunned, realizing that every time she looked at him, she had the feeling that she was looking at a work of art. She was fascinated by his beauty. How can a person look so amazing while sleeping? At that moment, the man moved, and she realized that he was waking up. The girl was seized with panic. She did not know what to do. He opened his eyes and sighed sweetly and looked around with an amethyst gaze. And then, pressing the pillow under himself, he smiled and looked at her with a satisfied look. The girl's cheeks burned with fire. Embarrassment appeared as a scarlet blush on her cheeks. He stood up on the bed and the sheet slid down, exposing his torso. The muscular chest looked very sexy. And then he reached out to her and kissed her on the forehead, wishing her good morning. Judith pulled away and awkwardly greeted him back. Her face turned crimson, and the girl felt awkward. The man carefully asked if she was feeling okay, and Judith replied that everything was fine. The young man alarmedly began to apologize that this was his first time, and he could not control himself. Judith felt uncomfortable with his words. She didn't believe him and wanted to ask him what he was saying. She remembered his frank caresses last night and wondered where he got such skills from, if this was his first time. His lie was so unpleasant that she said that she couldn't do it anymore. But he interpreted it differently and suggested calling the doctor. But Judith immediately blurted out that everything was fine. But did you think that he really thought it was necessary to invite a doctor? He stretched, and the muscles on his body tensed, stretching his skin. He asked that she must be hungry then? And at that time, Judith thought that her heart was trying to jump out of her chest at the sight of his body. She decided to build an iron defense and said that she usually doesn't eat in other people's houses and therefore would rather go to her own. But he decided differently, and saying that her face was too pale and she should eat before leaving, he rang the bell, calling the servants. Judith wanted to scream in despair for him to listen to her. She decided that this wouldn't work, and her father and brothers would sound the alarm if she didn't hurry up. So she quickly got out of bed to get dressed. She froze for a moment, thinking that he was looking at her. And then she turned and asked him to turn away for a minute. But the guy took a strand of her hair in his hand and said that she was asking him about this after everything she did last night, and asking her to call him by name, he brought a curl to his lips and kissed it. Judith began to remember and remembered how yesterday, in a fit of passion, she asked what his name was. This question caused surprise on the young man's face, but before kissing her, he said that his name was Theodore, and she thoughtfully repeated his name out loud. Theodore, continuing to run his fingers through a strand of her hair, smiled and said that she remembered. Judith covered her mouth with her hand and thought that it was natural. His face is simply impossible to forget. And she said that she remembered and added that she had to tell him something. The girl just opened her mouth and said that last night. Suddenly there was a knock on the door and she jumped in surprise. Theo grabbed her hand and pulled her towards him, covering her with his body from prying eyes. And then he asked who was there. A voice was heard from behind the door, reminding him that His Excellency Theodore wanted to see him. It was the valet. But Judith was amazed that the man with whom she spent the night was addressed as His Excellency. She pronounced this address with surprise. His Highness? And Theodore, looking at her, smiled and answered her appeal. Judith smiled sweetly, but there was a volcano seething inside her. She wanted to scream for help because she was so screwed up. They looked at each other, but there was an explanation for her reaction. The fact is that the man sitting in front of her is a tyrant. She was reborn in the novel she read before her death. The girl named Yoo Hye Sung was 21 years old. She was a college student and now lay and admired the book she had read. It was a fantasy romance novel called For My Emperor. The heroine becomes a knight at the imperial palace and goes through many difficulties. She had to go through a lot of suffering before they met. Well, later at the end of the story, they got married. Yoo Hye Sung threw back the blanket and, impressed by this story, said how lucky the main character was. Then she raised the phone to her face again and thought that Judith was a minor character, Judith Fergra Green. Unlike the main character, who had to make her way into the world on her own, Judith was born into a family of aristocrats. The family never loved the girl. In a fit of jealousy, she pursued the main character and then died the most pitiful death. Yoo Hye Sung thought that her family didn't like her either, just like Judith. And this comparison upset the girl. She thought that she didn't like this ending for her character. But now Yoo Hye Sung has become Judith. She remembered her infancy, how the servants looked after her. She was cared for and cherished. And she blinked her eyes out of confusion, not understanding what was happening. She worked like crazy in college for 3 years. It was about to be released. She couldn't wrap her head around the fact that she died a week ago in an accident. She began to cry, and the servants bent over her, not understanding what had happened that could upset the baby so much. And Yoo Hye Sung thought in despair that if she were to be reborn, at least into the main character, into Serne, she didn't want to die like Judith in the novella. And she prayed to the Lord that if he heard her, let him send her back to Korea. The maid took her in her arms, trying to calm the baby, whose eyes were full of tears. And she remembered the scene from the novel in which Theodore pierces Judith's chest with a sword. And the thought that she was destined to die at the hands of a tyrant pulsated in her head. Theodore Grey Liu Valdemar. He is the ruler of the Valdemar Empire, the largest in terms of territory on the entire continent. He was the only heir until the mistress of the previous emperor gave birth to a son. Theodore's position in the family became more and more deplorable every day. Unable to withstand such pressure, his mother committed suicide. When he was 19 years old, his father died and Theodore ascended the throne. Soon after this, the second prince suddenly died in a fire. A heartless, insensitive tyrant who killed first his father and then his brother just to gain power. This is the main male character of the novel, For the Sake of My Emperor, in which she appeared. You couldn't imagine a worse enemy for Judith. He killed her, his fiancée, because she interfered in his relationship with the main character. Baby Judith was drinking milk from a bottle. And then suddenly I thought, what if she and the ruler met long before those events? He wouldn't kill her. She thought that Judith was the only daughter of a nobleman living in the empire. And if everything goes well, then she will live happily ever after. Judith decided to use all her possibilities. She grew up as a cheerful child. She grew up and was nice and obedient to everyone. Unlike the life described in the novel, now her family loved her, and Judith caught herself thinking how wonderful the life of a villainess was, born with a golden spoon in her mouth. She thought that her family did not cause her any problems, and that she only had to deal with the emperor. She was so greedy for pretty boys. Looking at his face was already a pleasure, and she decided that it was time to meet him. And for this, you need to go to the imperial palace for a festive banquet in honor of the new year. She cannot sit within 4 walls all her life. And having gathered, Judith went to the banquet. She also wanted to finally enter into a relationship. It was a masquerade ball. The banquet was held for nobles who had just crossed the threshold of adulthood, and after the solemn speech, the emperor immediately left. In simple words, on this day, you can calmly look for your soulmate while hiding your face behind a mask. And Judith decided to have a blast. She asked to bring her a stronger drink. But the men who surrounded her that evening and met her at the ball were each worse than the other. And after a while, Judith noticed with disappointment that there was not a single handsome man here. Is this really the end of all the worthy gentlemen of the empire? And she decided that it was time to return home to her brothers. They probably missed her, but in one of the corridors she met him. A tall man with golden hair. He stood with his arms crossed over his chest and stared at her. From under the golden mask, amethyst-colored eyes looked at her searchingly. The look was serious. And the next moment his lips stretched into a slight smile. Judith froze. She was struck by his beauty, and the thought flashed through her mind that this was her future husband. But the stranger turned around and walked away. Judith just managed to open her mouth but couldn't say anything. Only after a few moments to detain him did she say a greeting. And at that moment, her mask fell off. Her face opened. But that didn't stop her. Judith was so interested in this man that she simply rushed after him. She grabbed the handle just as the door slammed behind him and, pushing it, said that she had asked him to wait. The stranger was alone in the room, and he stood with his back to her. Judith closed the door behind her and leaned her back against it. His voice reached her. He said displeasedly that he didn't even know. She was either very brave or very naive. And then, turning his face and looking at her out of the corner of his eye, he asked that she wasn't taught that following strangers was obviously a bad idea? But Judith blurted out in one breath that he had seduced her. The stranger closed his eyes and reached out with his hand to the mask hiding his face. And the next moment, he was already holding the mask in his hands, tearing it off his face and towering over Judith. A satisfied smile played on his lips, and he said that she had noticed correctly, and it was his fault. He silently drilled her with his amethyst gaze. Judith also looked at him with wide eyes and waited for him to continue. And he still hesitated. And then she grabbed the lapels of his cloak. Passion raged in her blood. Judith wanted to scream for him to stop treating her like a child, and the next moment she pressed her lips to his. Frankly, the stranger did not expect such pressure and was a little shocked. But his confusion did not last long. The mask fell from his hands to the floor, and he grabbed her head with his hand and responded to her demanding kiss. A few moments later, they were already lying on the bed. He kissed her neck, but Judith suddenly gasped, and the stranger immediately stopped and pulled away from her. He said that this was impossible, but Judith, wrapping her arms around his neck, asked what was wrong, and she assured him that she could do it too. The blonde with beautiful amethyst eyes sadly said that in the end she would regret it, but Judith was unstoppable. She smiled tenderly and said that she would never regret it. And again she clung to him with a tender kiss, making it clear that she would not back down. And now they were sitting at the table having breakfast, and Theo said how wonderful it was last night. But Judith was in a slightly different mood. She was sad and quietly lamented that how could it be possible not to recognize the emperor and make such a mistake. A picture of his muscular torso appeared before his gaze. Judith thought it was too late to think. She had already slept with the emperor. And all out of arrogant greed, the gaze wandered a little in the wrong direction. She thought that this was not the time for jokes and fell on her face before the emperor, saying that she had sinned terribly by allowing herself to do this in relation to his majesty. And she began to beg to spare her, promising that he would never see her again. Theodore looked at her searchingly, and an unkind fire lit up in his eyes. He questioned her, asking if she was leaving, and his restrainedly calm tone made Judith feel uneasy. She raised her head from the floor and heard pent-up anger. He exclaimed, "How dare she deprive the emperor of his virginity, and then just run away?" And he asked that she decided to get off with little blood. Judith jumped up and protested that he had misunderstood, and she was shaking with anger that he had made it sound like she had robbed him. But everything was by mutual agreement. Theodore looked at her bowed head and quietly called her name. The girl was slightly trembling nervously. She thought that apparently death from his hand could not be avoided. Whether now or later? Tears welled up in the girl's eyes. She loved her life so much. Could it really end now? But at that moment, Theodore leaned towards her and tenderly kissed the top of her head. This came as a surprise to her. But at the same time, he told her that she would have to take responsibility for stealing his virginity. Judith looked at him with wide eyes. She was slightly perplexed and did not understand what he meant by the words, "take responsibility." She waited for an explanation, but he was silent, just looking at her searchingly. Judith could not stand it and said that she was taking responsibility. And timidly smiling, she asked what to do now. From all the nervous shocks of that morning, she developed a serious appetite, and Judith began to gobble up the delicacies that they brought. Theodore watched her, asking if it tasted good, and she replied that it was very good. Judith also looked at him, thinking that he himself only demanded that she take responsibility, but in the end, he fed her delicious food. The girl wondered, is the emperor really a kind person? The girl shook her head and tried to drive away these thoughts. He is a tyrant, and all he cares about is Serna. But as soon as I looked at him again, I immediately noticed that he had such a sweet smile and a pleasant warmth spread in my chest. But Theodore's next question took her by surprise. And when he asked what, in her opinion, was the ideal date for the wedding, the girl choked on her food in surprise. She coughed, and he was worried if she was okay. And Judith couldn't believe her ears. What kind of wedding is he even talking about? And although the girl came to her senses a little, Theo continued to watch her anxiously. Then he angrily turned to the butler, asking him who had drawn up the menu for today. The butler bowed and replied that he was the chef. And the next moment, all the rage of the emperor fell on the unfortunate butler. Theo shouted that how could someone with a hangover be fed bread? His eyes became icy in a fit of anger. He asked that they really wanted her to choke and finally suffocate. Julia was amazed at how instantly the emperor flew into a rage, thinking that she had choked on her food. Meanwhile, Theodore ordered that the chef be imprisoned. She wanted to explain that the emperor simply surprised her greatly, and that's why she choked. But she was afraid to object to him, and yet, realizing that an innocent person could suffer because of her, she decided to say that she simply ate too quickly. But Theo knelt down in front of her and took her hand in his and said that it was not her fault. Not a trace of his anger remained. He was gentle and affectionate with her, and he added that it was just a piece of bread that was hard and bothered her, and at the same time, he called her his love. His eyes shone with extraordinary kindness and adoration, and Judith couldn't believe it was true. She felt like she was at home. And the girl thought that she didn't think that she would find more people here like her father and brothers. Her family, father and brothers, took care of her. She remembered how upset her father was when she tripped over a wooden plank left in the garden, and her brothers comforted her while she cried in pain. And then the father, like Theo now, angrily attacked the worker who left this board there and first fired him, and then decided to cut off his hands. But Judith could not tolerate the violence, and the next second she was smiling joyfully and reaching out to her father to attract his attention. He took her in his arms and they walked away. Judith always hugged her father and brothers to calm them down faster, and she thought that maybe it would work now. She looked at Theo and said that she would be very sorry if the cook was fired, because he made such delicious bread. And he, as if under a spell, ordered the butler to tell the chef to prepare the menu more carefully next time, and added that he should be paid a reward. Judith was surprised. Did it really work? But Theo was already at her feet. He still looked at her with adoration, as if asking if he had done everything and was she happy? But Judith covered her face with her hands and mentally asked him not to look at her with those eyes. He just nearly ruined a man's life. Theodore sat down next to her on the bed and, hugging her, suggested returning to the conversation about the wedding. Judith smiled nervously and hesitantly said the word wedding. The girl thought that she would soon get indigestion from such conversations. But Theo asked that doesn't that mean taking responsibility? But Judith again mentally indignant. How did he come to such a conclusion? She clutched the fabric of her skirt and decided that she wanted to refuse. In the original story, Judith also had to marry Theodore. But if she follows the plot, she will certainly die. But it was also scary to reject him. What if her father and brothers suffered because of her decision? Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a servant. He asked for forgiveness and told the emperor that it was urgent. This sudden intervention angered Theodore again. He asked irritably, "What's the matter?" And while the servant reported why he had disturbed the emperor, Judith mentally thanked him. She had a little time to think about the current situation. After a few moments, the emperor turned to her and said that he apologized to her, but he would have to leave for a while. But before leaving, he approached her and pulled her head towards him, kissed her tenderly, and told her to rest, and he would return soon. And then he added that she would let her know if anything bothered her. Judith waved as Theodore left and wished him luck. After some time, the emperor sat on the throne and listened to the man who stood in front of him. A servant standing next to the emperor, it was his assistant Alphena, noted that today he looked sadder than usual. Meanwhile, Theodore turned to the man who came, asking what brought him to him early in the morning. It was Lord Fergra Green. He apologized to His Majesty, and he asked to give him permission and let his soldiers in to search the castle territory. Duke Genervus Fergra Green was the head of the Council of Nobles, and he looked extremely upset. The emperor asked why he needed this. And then the duke sadly told him that his daughter was missing. Did the emperor specify that his daughter's name is Fergra Green? His face lit up at the memory of her name, and the duke said that she had not been seen since yesterday's event. The emperor slowly repeated after him, and the duke added that they turned everything upside down, but she seemed to have evaporated. And then the emperor said that the disappearance of the young lady was a big problem. He will make an exception and give them permission to search. The duke was very grateful to him for his understanding. However, searching the imperial palace is unthinkable. And Theodore said that the duke should not forget that this was possible only through the kindness of the ruler. Duke Fergra Green bowed his head in respect and said that he would never forget his grace. And then the emperor allowed him to go. After the duke left, the emperor became thoughtful, and a good-natured smile played on his face. But a few moments later, the silence was broken by a servant who burst into the hall and, falling to his knees, said that the young lady, his guest, the young lady who was in his room, had disappeared. While Emperor Theodore was talking with her father, Judith was making a plan to sneak out of this palace unnoticed. She managed to sneak out of the room unnoticed, but further on her way stood guards. She mentally decided to repeat her plan. Firstly, she had already left a note with an excuse, so as not to anger the emperor. Secondly, she will move very carefully and will leave the castle unnoticed. Thirdly, she will ask the maid Marie to pretend to be her and leave the country in order to completely confuse the emperor. Fourthly, even if the emperor goes in search of her, he will find Marie and give up because he cannot find her. And finally, if the emperor falls in love with Serena, as happened in the novel, the problem will be solved. Everything will be all right. Having come up with this plan, Judith felt relieved and praised herself for her resourcefulness. She will be able to continue living with a family who adores her. And she decided that the plan was truly flawless. And when Judith was ready to carry out her plan, she suddenly realized that she had lost her identification badge. And when she realized this, her note along with the token was delivered to the emperor. The servant who brought these things said that they found the token in the corridor of the banquet hall. They also found a note next to the bed. The emperor remembered how he met Judith yesterday, how she called out to him in the deserted corridor, how she devoured food this morning, and he thought that she was so sweet. His face was illuminated by a mysterious smile. The emperor bowed his head and wondered if he had already fallen in love. And this dreamy expression on his face was noticed by Alphen's assistant. The servant, who was still on his knees, and who brought the news that the girl had disappeared, turned to the emperor and asked with trepidation what punishment awaited him. But the emperor stood up from the throne and, passing by, told him to forget about it, and added that he would be gone for some time. And the servant fell face down and said that he was very sorry. At the same time, Judith, still trying to escape. She watched the guards from behind the door and thought that if she told everything to the guards and confirmed her identity, she would be able to leave. She also thought that if the tyrant Theodore found out that she was Princess Fergry, then she would be finished. She could only imagine the rage this would cause in him. Judith was thinking about how she could attract the attention of the guards, when suddenly a man's voice was heard saying that someone should wait until he called his father, and Judith noted that this voice was quite familiar to her. She didn't even immediately believe in her luck. Her brother Cain stood near the guard. She called him, and the young man was at first confused, not believing his luck. But when she joyfully rushed to meet him, he said her name with relief. Finally, they found her safe and sound. But the imperial guard stopped Judith, preventing her from going to her brother. The guard politely apologized, but insisted that they first needed to confirm her identity. Cain Fergra put his hand on the guard's shoulder and tried to stop him. He said that this girl was his younger sister, Princess Fergry, and he vouched that it was really her, and asked the guards to take the disgusting weapon away from her. Cain Fergra was the head of the Knights of Aden and Judith's older brother. His assurances were quite enough to confirm her identity, and the guard cleared the way, apologizing. And Judith happily noted that this is the strength of the knights. She approached her brother and mentally thanked God that Cain was nearby. And I thought that I needed to return home soon. Cain's face showed extreme concern. He stretched out his hands to her and grabbed her face and asked where she was. Is she injured? Maybe someone scared her? But Judith only apologized and said that she drank too much and fell asleep. He looked into her wide eyes, trying to read the answer in them whether this was so. But Judith smiled. She said again that she just fell asleep and woke up in the morning. And she thought that she woke up with the emperor. Cain said that it's good that everything is in order and told Judith that he should call his father and she can get into the carriage. This came as a surprise to Judith. She was excited because her father was also in the palace. But Cain explained that he was also worried about her, so he went to ask His Highness to search the palace. Judith realized that if her father went to His Majesty, then she might have problems if he found out everything, and she desperately didn't want that. so she threw herself on Kane's chest. There were tears in her eyes, and she said in frustration that she felt so tired because of the drinking and asked them to go home first. Kane turned to the knight standing closest, saying that he would go home with Judith and they should wait for their father. And at this time, Judith mentally asked Kane for forgiveness for deceiving him. She had to save her life. And only when they got into the carriage and it started moving, Judith became a little calmer. After some time, they arrived at the mansion of Duke Fergra. It was a real palace with fountains and beautifully trimmed bushes in front of the main staircase. The butler opened the door and from the threshold informed the young man who was in the hall that Miss Judith was home. And he joyfully asked that they had found her? It was Toussaint Fergre, the owner of the tower and Judith's younger brother. His face lit up with a joyful smile, and when Kane and Judith came in after the butler, he jumped up to them and began to ask why she didn't go with him. Why was she brought here? Is she injured? And where was she anyway? These questions made her dizzy, and she wanted to ask him not to ask so many of them. But instead, she asked what happened to his clothes. There were stains on it that looked like blood. But Toussaint shrugged it off and laughed cheerfully, saying that it was nothing and she didn't have to worry. He didn't kill anyone. But at that moment, they were interrupted by their father's voice. He called Judith, and they all turned to his voice. A middle-aged man stood at the door. His face was alarmed. He called his daughter Baby and asked if she knew how worried he was. Finally, all three men of the Green Fergra mansion were assembled. The older brother is the head of the knights. The younger brother is the owner of the magic tower and an incredibly strong father. Judith was both happy and alarmed at the same time. She could only squeeze out an apology, but Duke Fergre came up to her and hugged her and said that now that she was next to her daddy, everything was fine. He asked if she was injured anywhere, but Kane said she complained of being tired. And hearing this, the Duke ordered to urgently call a doctor, and that was all Judith needed. She was again overcome by despair, but she knew her father. He was worried, and therefore there was no question of contradicting him. And when the doctor finished his examination, the whole family gathered in the room again to hear his verdict. But when the doctor said that Judith seemed to be unwell due to drinking too much alcohol, all the men of the Fergra family were amazed. They were alarmed. Can this be treated? And what to do about it? Judith was tired of this supervision. As soon as she leaves for a while, this house turns into a booth. She rose to her feet and, turning to her father and brothers, said that she was much better and they could return to work. They all had important positions. And to finally convince them, she smiled her most radiant smile and said that she felt better as soon as she saw them. Both the brothers and father immediately melted from this smile, as if Judith had a secret power to make people fall in love with her as soon as she smiled. They left her room and promised to return after work, and Judith saw them off, thinking that they were such simpletons. Soon night fell on the Fergra family castle. Lights came on in the windows. The night turned out to be moonlit, and the moon illuminated the entire area. Judith opened the window of her room. She was dressed in a maid's outfit. This was the next part of her plan. From behind them came the hesitant voice of the maid, who asked if they really needed to do this. Judith looked over her shoulder. She was determined, but seeing the confusion of the maid, she turned to her and took her hands. The girl immediately admitted that she doubted that she could cope with the role of a noble lady. But Judith said that everything would be all right, and added that if her father said anything, Marie would have to show him the letter. And with these words, Judith climbed out through the window and waved goodbye to the crying Marie. The moon illuminated the road, and Judith boldly walked through the park that surrounded the castle. She was sure that the hole in the fence was somewhere nearby, and indeed, soon she came across this hole, through which she was going to get out of the castle unnoticed. Judith began to bend the grass to get through, and soon, half of her body was already on the other side of the fence. She thought she was tormented by guilt, but she had no choice. When she squeezed through and found herself behind the fence, her face was crowned with a joyful smile. She was able to escape. Now all that remained was to get to the port. At that moment, someone called the girl, and she raised her surprised face looking at the man who towered over her. It was him, Theodore. He looked at her smiling. The moon illuminated his figure, creating a halo of his hair around his head. Theo said that he came for her, and he extended his hand to her. When he and Judith returned to the palace, they were greeted by a polished staircase, laid with a red carpet, and servants lined up on both sides of the stairs in respect, bowing their heads. Judith smiled and thought that after all, she was here again, in the tiger's den, although no, more like a dragon. Theodore glanced sideways at her, watching her reaction. Meanwhile, Judith drew attention to the painting near which they were passing and noted to herself that it was quite luxurious here, the imperial palace after all. Theodore asked her if she liked it. Maybe she wants to take a closer look. And Judith agreed, not in the mood to refuse. Theodore said that they said the first emperor of Valdemar was half man, half dragon. That is why the symbol of the imperial palace is the dragon. He smiled and continued to say that even now, from time to time, a member of the imperial family could inherit the power of a dragon. And Judith wondered if he was bragging. Based on the description in the novel, Theo has inherited the following dragon powers. The first is a body as durable as dragon scales. The second is unimaginable power, similar to that possessed by her father and brother Cain. And the third is Rakion, a sword with its own consciousness, belonging to the first emperor. Judith looked fascinated at the picture in front of her and thought that all this was in the picture. Theodore suggested moving on, and she agreed without taking her eyes off the picture. When they walked away from the picture, she thought that with all his abilities, Theodore would be considered an emperor, even with the stigma of murdering his entire family. Theo walked next to her and watched her closely. Another door was opened in front of them, and they entered them. Judith was still thinking that he would soon meet the main character Serna and find the love of his life. And then she would become a free person. Entering the room, Todor began to undress, taking off his shirt and exposing his torso, and Judith continued to close her eyes and remain in her dreams, thinking that she would happily live in the role of a supporting character. When she came to her senses and opened her eyes, she exclaimed in surprise and asked Theodore, who was standing with his torso bare, what was he doing? Her cheeks glowed with a blush of embarrassment, and lowering her eyes to the floor, she said that with all due respect to His Majesty, but she was not ready to spend the night with him. But Theodore, as if nothing had happened, said that she would need different clothes. He only has his pajamas, and in the morning he will immediately call the tailor, so he suggested that she be patient for a while. Judith thanked him for his concern, and she herself thought that she was confused because he began to undress and eventually became noisy. And now I felt terribly awkward. Theodore put on a robe and, squinting his eyes, looked in the direction where Judith was changing. She had already put on the suit he offered her. The color suited her. She also looked at him and said that she had changed into the clothes he gave her. Judith thought that the fabric was a little thin, but Theodore suddenly asked her forgiveness, which confused her. She didn't understand what he was talking about, and he, in turn, took the fabric of the lapels of the robe she was wearing, and pulling her towards him, said that yesterday he could not control himself. And he added that he should have been more careful. Judith looked at him and thought that she didn't know why, but she felt sorry for him. She was slightly embarrassed and lowered her eyes and said that yesterday everything was fine. Therefore, you shouldn't blame yourself so much. Theodore leaned close to her ear and whispered the question. If that was the case, could they do it again? He pulled back a little and looked at her, and then asked again if they could do this. Judith was slightly startled. The thought was spinning in her head that he had really come for her because of this. But suddenly, without waiting for her answer, he raised his hands up and said that it was already late, so it was time for them to go to bed. And this change in him again surprised her. So he needs her? He put her to bed and leaned over and kissed her forehead, wishing her good night. Judith just thought that according to the plan, she was not supposed to have any relationship with the emperor, but she came to the conclusion that it would also be nice. And when Theodore, hugging her, lay down next to her and began to doze, she was overcome with disappointment. She wanted intimacy, and she didn't understand how he could stop now. And why is he so calm? In the morning, she woke up again with a smile on her face. She felt warm and comfortable in his arms, and when she woke up, she said that after all, a man's breast should be big. Theodore was no longer sleeping. He was just lying there with his eyes closed, so he asked why she liked his chest so much. At these words, Judith opened her eyes. She didn't immediately understand where she was, but her memory returned quickly, and a feeling of déjà vu came to her. She sat up abruptly on the bed and asked to forgive her, but Theo replied that everything was fine and that she should not worry. But Judith protested. She didn't know that he had already woken up, and so I asked her to forgive me again. Theo also stood up and picked her up, surprising Judith again. Her face was so close to his, and he looked at her with such tenderness. He carried her to the table where breakfast was waiting for them, and when he sat her down on a chair and sat down next to her, he asked how she was feeling, and he added that she needed to eat. Judith looked at the table laden with food, and her appetite began to awaken. She began to chew and said that she felt better today than yesterday. Theodore watched her eat and said that it was good. Judith looked at him. She noted that he was in a good mood. And I thought, why would this be? She had a bad feeling. Theo's next question confirmed her feelings. He suggested returning to their conversation yesterday about their wedding, and he asked what day she wanted to spend it. Judith froze, and Theo, without letting her come to her senses, again proposed that the wedding could be scheduled for the day after tomorrow. She wanted to scream that he was completely crazy. How can you schedule a wedding for the day after tomorrow? She put her fingers to her temples and thought that she was in huge trouble. She didn't think he would listen to her at all, but the wedding must be stopped no matter what. Judith was thinking intently. Finally, she said hesitantly that the truth was that she had dared to deceive His Majesty. Now Theo was surprised, and Judith, clasping her fingers in front of her and looking at him, blurted out that in fact she was not Lady Judith, but a servant of the Duke's daughter Fergra Green. Theo didn't believe it, but Judith continued and told the story that in fact she asked her mistress to visit the palace at least once, and she sent her to the masquerade ball in her place. She blurted out that a commoner could not marry the emperor, and so she asked him. She paused and fell silent, and she thought that she was running out of excuses. But after listening to her, Theo took a strand of her hair in his palm and looking into her eyes, said that everything was in order because he wanted to marry her, and therefore will not allow anyone to object. Judith smiled and thought that since he said so, what else could be added? It's May, and Theo will meet Cerny at the Harvest Festival in September. Until then, there is one more way to fix everything. She looked at him and said that she wanted to get married on the day when cherry blossoms fly in the air like snow. Theodore's mood immediately deteriorated. He became sad and asked why then. Judith thought that the cherry trees would bloom next March. And I thought that maybe she had gone too far. But she looked so inspired that Theo said that it would be so. He supported his head with one hand, and in the other he still held a strand of her hair and smiled and said that they would do this on the day when cherry blossoms would fly in the air. And while they were talking like this, at the same time in the Duchy of Fergre, there was again commotion and turmoil. Duke Fergret exclaimed menacingly that his daughter Judith was missing. He couldn't believe it. The eyes of all the men of the Fergre family were fixed on the maid Marie. The girl was trembling with fear and stutteringly trying to clearly explain what had happened. She asked for forgiveness and said that Lady Judith had said that if she showed the letter to His Excellency, he would understand everything. And with shaking hands, she handed them the letter. The sons surrounded their father, and together they began to read the message that Judith had left for them. In it, she addressed them specifically. Judith wrote that when they read this letter, she will no longer be here. Tears welled up in the old Duke's eyes. She explained that yesterday at the masquerade ball, she made a mistake with the Emperor, and added that she decided to hide for a while in fear that the Emperor's anger would affect her father and brothers. Cain raised his hand to his mouth and froze in confusion. Father continued to read that if His Majesty was looking for Judith, they would send Marie. The younger brother closed his eyes, trying to comprehend what had happened, and the father finished reading his daughter's thoughts that the Emperor would most likely give up trying to find her if he realized that it was not her. She asked her to forgive her for worrying her, not to worry too much, and to take care of herself until they met again. When the last word was read, no one hid their tears. 3 strong men mourned the separation from their loved one. Duke Fergre's hands trembled, and he said that the Emperor frightened her so much that their Judith decided to run away. But the Duke soon pulled himself together and began giving orders in an instant. He instructed his sons to gather knights and comb the capital. She shouldn't have gone far. The sons unquestioningly obeyed their father, completely agreeing with his decision. But before leaving, Totsen asked his father what he was going to do. Duke Fergre clasped his fingers, and looking ahead with a concentrated gaze, said that he would head to the imperial palace. It was morning in the imperial palace, and from the very morning there was bustle here, and all because of Judith's outfits. In the end, she was so tired, from trying on dresses all morning like she was on a catwalk. But now she was sitting in a beautiful dress, and it was Theo's choice. He even got angry when the servant accidentally stepped on the dress. This made Judith a little sad, and she thought that Theo was acting just like her family, as if the whole world is threatening her and only he can protect her from everyone. At that moment, they passed by a large painting on the wall, and it caught Judith's attention. It showed a boy with golden hair and dark purple eyes. He was still small, but already so beautiful. Julia turned to Theo and smilingly asked that the child in the picture is His Majesty, and he dejectedly asked that she recognized him, and she crossed her arms over her chest and answered smugly that this boy was exactly like Theo. The Emperor asked what else she wanted to say, and then Julia, looking sideways at him, thought, what does he want to hear from her? And after thinking, she said that he was already so handsome as a child. Theodore squinted at her and looked at her with a sad look. He didn't answer, just watched silently. And then he turned away completely, and Judith asked excitedly, did she say something wrong? But Theo said no, but she still thought he was upset about something. They continued to walk along the long gallery, and Judith asked why His Majesty wanted to marry her. And Theo answered honestly that because he spent the first night with her. Judith stopped and asked what if he had spent it with someone else. But Theo replied that this would not have happened. She looked into his eyes, trying to recognize even the slightest hint of a lie on his part, and then thought that he would change his mind when he met Serena. Judith smiled and said that he might regret marrying the one with whom he spent only one night. What if someone better meets her? But Theo cut her off mid-sentence and seriously said that there was no one better than her. But even if he does, he doesn't want anyone. He only wants one Judith. He intertwined the fingers of their hands, squeezed her palm tightly, and said that she didn't remember anything. She just had to keep one thing in mind. And raising her palm to his lips, he said that he was not going to let her go anywhere. And with these words, he pressed his lips to the soft skin of her palm, making Judith feel the gentle warmth of his touch. She looked at him with wide eyes. A slight blush of embarrassment appeared on her cheeks. And at that moment, a scream was heard from behind the door. The servant tried to stop someone saying that he could not enter. Theo pulled her towards him and hugged her, and the servant continued to exclaim that His Excellency must wait. Suddenly, Judith recognized the voice of the man whom the butler was trying to detain, and she had a bad feeling. The furious voice of Duke Fergra was heard in the room, saying that he had finally found the Emperor. He looked at Theodore, and his speech stopped mid-sentence. All he had time to say was that his daughter. He called Judith in surprise. There was an awkward silence, and only Theodore smiled joyfully as if rejoicing at this meeting. Soon they were sitting at the dinner table, the Duke and his sons, and Theodore and Judith. Theodore raised his glass and said that they could eat as much as they wanted. His face still showed joy, but Duke Fergret thought that who would be able to eat in such an atmosphere? And he directly asked His Majesty about what Judith had done, and he added that as her father, he would take the punishment in her place. She wanted to scream for her father to stop, but Theo said that she had committed a very serious crime. He said that night, but he didn't have time to finish because Judith started coughing, wanting everyone to shut up. And her brothers immediately became alarmed and asked if everything was okay with her, and Theodore immediately gave instructions to call a doctor. But Judith, wanting to stop him, protested, saying that she was fine. She became depressed, and closing her eyes, thought with regret that the doctor would not help her now. She took a deep breath, and gathering her courage, said that at the masquerade ball, she spent the night with the Emperor. Everyone was looking at her anyway, but after she said the last words, it seemed to her that they were digging into her. Her loved ones, her brothers, looked with such bewilderment as if a tub of ice water had been poured on them, and only Theodore sparkled with happiness, as if he didn't notice how tense the atmosphere around him was. The father was the first to find the gift of speech, but he could only utter one word and ask who, and what happened. Judith clenched her fists and said that she was very sorry. The girl thought that she was not very worried about her first time, but her family must be very disappointed in her. Duke Fergret, when the whole truth was imprinted in his mind, jumped up from his seat and angrily exclaimed that how dare His Majesty commit such an act with his daughter. At first, Judith was stunned by her father's treatment. After all, before him was the Emperor. She wanted to stop him, to protect him from such a mistake. She said that there was a misunderstanding, and she added that it was she who seduced the Emperor. Tutsin jumped up and blurted out that this was shamelessness. The eyes of Cain and Tutsin burned with the fire of anger and hatred. A blue flame burned in Tutsin's palm, and he said that His Majesty ordered their innocent Judith to say this. Cain, in turn, grabbed the hilt of his sword and growled that what a shame, the man to whom he had sworn allegiance all these years turned out to be a vile thief. Judith was surprised by this development. She sobbed, realizing that for such an insult, her loved ones could be severely punished. And Tukin continued his tirade by asking why their little angel would seduce someone like His Majesty, but Theodore seemed unshakable and only said that they might not believe him. But Judith took his virginity and in return promised to take responsibility for him. Duke Fergret was confused. He asked hesitantly, "What does the Emperor mean by saying that he will marry Judith just for one night?" Emperor Theodore replied that he was a man who greatly valued decency, and he added that he vowed to give everything for the woman he loves. Judith's throat was dry from their argument, and she, drinking water from a cup, thought in the silence that her father seemed to be in shock. And the men continued to glare at each other. And then Duke Fergret said that since they were talking about it, he wanted to know what date the wedding should be planned for. And he added that he doesn't mind even if she comes tomorrow. But Judith took his hand and asked him to stop. Duke Fergret looked at his daughter silently. There were tears in Judith's eyes. She looked at him pleadingly, and in her father's eyes she found no condemnation, only excitement splashing in them, as well as love and care. He put his arm around his daughter's shoulders and said that in their time there was nothing wrong with two unmarried people spending the night together before the wedding. He made Judith stand up from her seat. They left the table and headed towards the exit from the dining room. On the way, the Duke turned around and said that everything had happened by mutual consent, and his daughter had not committed any crimes against His Majesty. And wishing him all the best, he decided to leave the palace. Judith walked ahead of her father, pushed towards the exit by him. Was she worried about how Theodore would react? And she had a bad feeling. And the father carefully said that she was probably tired, and therefore they should go home. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Theodore rise from his seat, and the phrase he addressed to her father, the Duke, reached her, asking if he remembered his promise this morning. Duke Fergret turned to the Emperor, and he said that for his permission to search the castle, the Duke promised him compensation. And the Duke confirmed that it was so. And then Theodore said that in this case, he wants the Duke to accept him as his son-in-law. And smiling broadly, he asked what he thought about it. But no one seemed to particularly share his amusement about this. The brothers looked at him with challenge and open hostility. The Duke also made it clear with his entire appearance that he was dissatisfied. It was as if he saw a madman in the face of the Emperor. But apparently, Theodore was not at all embarrassed by this. He continued to sit at the table, smiling peacefully and waiting for an answer. It seemed that no barbs from the Fergret family bothered him, but Judith began to worry that if this continued, her father and brothers would be branded traitors. And realizing that in this case only she can stop this squabble, she screamed with all her might for everyone to stop. Judith fell silent and waited for everyone to pay attention to her. She clenched her fists. It seemed that she was about to burst from indignation. Theodore looked at her and admired how cutely she cursed at her father and brothers, just like an adult. Little adult. He noticed that in order to scream so loudly, she had to clench her fists and use all her strength. Meanwhile, Judith proposed to do this. Since they still don't know each other well, then to begin with, she will visit His Majesty at the castle every day. Theodore listened carefully to her proposal. Meanwhile, she continued that then, if His Majesty did not change his mind, they would discuss their wedding again. Duke Fergret objected. He was against it. But Judith crossed her arms over her chest and said in a categorical tone that objections would not be accepted. And she added that, as she said, she would take responsibility. The three Fergret men looked at her silently, thinking about where she got so much stubbornness from. And Judith, having no longer encountered any resistance, exhaled with relief and thought that this had finally been sorted out. Well, now she has again become a sweet and obedient girl, and smiling at her father with the sweetest smile, she said that now they will go home. And this tactic, as always, yielded results. The men of the Fergret family burst into smiles, not having the strength to contradict such a cutie. Judith took advantage of the moment to push her brothers towards the exit, trying to get them out of here as quickly as possible. But at the last moment, she heard Theodore call out to her, and Judith turned to his call. He looked completely miserable. It seemed that something most important in life had been taken away from the Emperor, and it had lost all meaning. But Judith frowned. There was no way to pity her with such a look. But at the same time, several emotions were fighting within her. She was glad that the Emperor missed her and was angry that he could not wait until the next meeting and not seem so unhappy. And she strictly said that they would see each other tomorrow. Finally, she was home in the family mansion. And now that she was left alone, Judith looked at herself in the mirror and smiled joyfully. She thought she did a good job. But the next moment her smile faded. She thought she was screaming so loud, but in fact, she was very scared to meet Theo tomorrow. She felt uneasy, and the girl thought that she would really die before the start of the original story. But she immediately pulled herself together, deciding that now was not the time to become limp. Judith died because she interfered in Theo and Serna's relationship, and she firmly decided that she would protect the love of Theo and Serna. She remembered Theo. That morning when he woke up after their first night, he looked happy, and she had doubts. Is it normal to date someone with thoughts of breaking up? The girl remembered how sweetly he smiled at her, how his eyes shone with kindness and joy. He is sweet and kind. And suddenly, Judith caught herself thinking that she wouldn't want to lose him. She began to daydream. She actually really liked Theo. She liked his concern. The girl became serious again. She suddenly thought that Theo, by the way, seemed to have become softer than in the original story. He was definitely a straightforward character, even when he met Serna. She wondered why he changed. And at that moment there was a knock on the door. These were Tutsin and Kane. They entered the room and greeted their sister with a smile. Judith was glad to see them, although she was awkward because of what happened today. Tukin said that quite a long time had passed since their last special training in magic, and he offered to arrange it today, playing with magical blue fire. Judith was pleased with his proposal and agreed with great pleasure. There was a fact, known to everyone today, that among the distant ancestors of Fergra Green there were demons. Tutsin, Kane, and Judith were at training. Her father watched them from the balcony and warned Judith that something was approaching her from behind. Therefore, some of their family's descendants, such as the Duke and his eldest son Kane, are born with powers beyond human powers. But in fact, Judith's body also inherited demonic powers. She turned to see who was behind her, and I saw an approaching clot of blue energy. But she didn't have time to react, and he pierced her back. And only at the end was she able to build a protective shield. But it was already too late. Judith was upset that she couldn't do it again, and Tudson suggested interrupting. She thought it was a useless absorption of magic. The three of them sat down in the shade of a spreading tree. Judith took a cup of tea and said sadly that, after all, she had no talent for magic at all, and she suggested stopping training. Still, nothing threatened her at home, but Tutsin was serious. Therefore, looking at his sister and asking her to listen carefully, he said that there are only two types of men in the world. Judith hesitantly asked about yes type, and Tutsin immediately replied that these were scum and dogs. Such a statement made Judith choke. Kane offered her a napkin to wipe herself and asked if everything was okay. The girl nodded that she was fine, and Tudson continued saying that you never know what kind of scoundrel you will run into in life, so it wouldn't hurt to learn self-defense magic. In addition, he added that she has the heart of an angel, and even this damn emperor will meet with her every day. Judith thought that she really didn't want to see him every day, but she looked at Tutson and asked what type of man he was. Tutson thought for a while, and then seriously replied that his brother and he belonged to the good scum, and he added that his little sister should only know good scum. Kane apparently did not agree with the fact that he was classified as trash, and therefore was indignant. But Tutson smiled, and said that he said this in a good sense of the word. And Judith smiled at this good exchange between the brothers. She was glad they weren't angry about what happened. When the training ended and she went to her room, she felt much better. My soul felt lighter. She met her father in the corridor. He looked gloomy. They went out onto the terrace together and approached the railing. The Duke rested his hands on the parapet and asked that she was going to the imperial palace, where this monster lived. Judith was struck by her father's tone. She looked at him and asked him not to worry so much. But I thought to myself that if someone saw him, they would think that she was already getting married. Judith decided to cheer him up and told him not to take everything so personally. And the Duke apologized for making his daughter worry about him. He said that Judith was already an adult, and there was nothing wrong with having a close relationship with another person. Judith looked at him carefully and listened. The Duke looked at her and said in a fatherly manner that he and her brothers, no matter who she chooses, they will never be satisfied. He stroked her head and, softening his tone, asked her to remember. No matter what choice she makes, she will always remain the most dear to them. Tears welled up in Judith's eyes. Her father is so kind to her, he really cares about her, and Judith threw herself into his arms, saying that she loved him and that she was happy to be his daughter. The girl understood that she had a family that would always support her. Evening was coming, and Judith thought that with such support, how could she not cope with anything? At this moment, Theo was in thought. He sat in his office and was thinking intently about something, tapping his fingers on the table. Nearby, as always, was his faithful servant and assistant Alphen. He watched his emperor, and looking at his condition, thought that it seemed that he was having a hard time. At that moment, the emperor turned to him and asked him to get the tears of hysteria, which caused extraordinary surprise among the servant. Tears of hysteria. It was a ring. The most expensive diamond ring sold on the black market. Alphen wanted to jump for joy. His Majesty said that he would use it when the woman he loved appeared. The servant already thought that the emperor would never remember about him, and he was glad that the old problem of the butler Alphen had finally been resolved. And at that moment, the emperor added that the butler should also make the cherry blossoms bloom. It doesn't matter how much money it takes. And at that moment, Alfina almost choked on what he heard. At first, he thought that he had misunderstood and said that all the cherry blossoms fell last month. They would have to wait until next year for them to bloom again. But the emperor irritably said that Alfina was too talkative today. This was not a good sign. The emperor began to get angry, and in the end, in anger, he said that Alfina should make them bloom no matter what. At this time, Cain was sorting out papers in his office. He kept thinking about the damn thief. During the war, the emperor showed no interest in women. How dare he do this to their Judith? At that moment, the butler entered the room and distracted him from his heavy thoughts. Cain asked what was the matter, and the butler hesitatingly replied that guests were waiting in the hall. The emperor himself appeared to them. He greeted Lord Cain. Cain stood opposite the emperor and thought that the bastard whom he wanted to strangle had come. Cain did not respond to the greeting, and the emperor said that he was disrespecting him. In a stony tone, Cain said, hammering out every word, that he too wished the emperor the most wonderful day, and he asked what brought him to them so early in the morning. The emperor turned away from him and said that he had come in search of Judith. But Cain's indignation still prevailed, and he irritably asked why look for her. But the emperor still calmly replied that she promised to visit him. Cain objected that she was still sleeping, and Theodore said that this is wonderful, then he will look at her sleeping. Cain was overwhelmed with anger, and he replied indignantly that under no circumstances. He added that Judith doesn't sleep well if anyone is around. The emperor was surprised that this was really so. His face became dreamy, and he said that she slept so sweetly in his arms. The two men's eyes met. It was like lightning flashed between them. The atmosphere became tense. At this time, the butler, not daring to wake Judith, begged her to wake up and save them, for it was only in her power, and Judith actually opened her eyes, as if she was having a nightmare. She sat up in bed and thought that she seemed to have felt someone's desperate pleas. She called Marie to help her change clothes, but the maid did not respond, and Judith thought it was so strange that no one was around. But at that moment, Marie came in and said in surprise that the lady woke up so early. Judith looked at her no less surprised and asked what was going on. Why was everyone so busy? And the maid sighed and said that her mistress still didn't know anything. And when she told that His Majesty the Emperor had arrived to see her early in the morning, Judith was amazed. She got ready as quickly as she could. The maid said they were talking in the junior lord's room on the second floor, and Judith was haunted by the thought of what they were up to this time. Judith walked to the door. It was slightly open. The girl stopped and saw Tützen talking about her first drawing in which she drew him. She heard Cain's voice, who said that she had succeeded in conveying the resemblance perfectly, and he proudly added that Judith had specifically depicted him as taller than other children of his height. Judith thought indignantly about what he was showing him there. Tützen held the framed drawing in his hands, and the emperor leaned over to look at it and said in admiration that she only needed a few lines to achieve a stunning resemblance, and added that he liked abstract painting. And again she heard Cain's voice, saying that this was the doll that Judith had made for his birthday. And again Theo, looking at some gray rags, said with admiration that this was a simple and unconventional form, just to his liking. Then Tützen boasted that Judith wrote a letter for his birthday. On plain paper, in crooked handwriting, it was written that she loved him. But Tushing proudly asked, "Isn't the handwriting elegant?" Judith's brothers boasted about her handicrafts, and they were so proud of them that Emperor Theodore, looking sadly at the last letter, said that he also wanted one. Peeking at them from behind the door, Judith heard him say that he only had one thing, and fell silent without finishing. Judith remembered how, after their first night, she left him a note, and thought that Theodore didn't show her brothers anything. That letter she wrote to him? But the guy still didn't stop. And then Tutson, holding an empty fabric bag in his hands, said that this was a package that contained cookies that Judith had baked herself. He ate the cookies and kept the packaging as a souvenir. Judith thought with annoyance what she should do with these fools, and Theo, meanwhile, extended his finger to touch the bag. But Tutson abruptly removed his hand and shouted that His Majesty should not touch him. He'll leave fingerprints! This struck Theo unpleasantly. He remained silent, but the first negative emotions began to creep into his soul. He took Judith, and they arrived at the castle. Theodore thought this meeting over. Emu wanted to capture his beloved girl, and so the artist was waiting for them in the castle. She and Theo sat on the sofa and posed for the artist who was painting their portrait. Judith thought that it was no wonder that he was so jealous of her brothers. She thought that sometimes he acted just like them. They had been sitting like this for some time, and Judith thought that apparently the portrait took a lot of time. They had been sitting in silence for so long that she was starting to feel sleepy. She closed her eyes and fell into a doze. Her head became heavy, and she leaned her elbows on Theo's shoulder. He called her quietly, but she only mumbled something inaudibly in response. Theodore could not understand what was wrong with her. He tried to wake her, but Judith did not make any sounds or move. Her head rested on his chest, and she felt so pleased that a slight smile froze on her lips. Theodore grabbed her around the waist. Restless thoughts began to trouble him. He called Alphen and gave him some orders. The artist looked up from the canvas and also began to look at what had happened. He silently watched the bustle and could not understand what was happening. Was the emperor angry because he was drawing longer than necessary? But the emperor himself ordered him not to rush. The emperor, picking up Judith in his arms, looked at the artist and said that he had probably captured an approximate image. When he finished, let him bring the picture to his office. He turned around and walked away with such a precious burden in his arms. The artist just bowed his head, making it clear that he would do everything. Tutson and his squad arrived in the park. His face expressed extreme irritability. The people from his squad did not understand the mood of their partner. What caused such a disgusting mood? He was unusually rude and even came to hunt monsters, although usually he is not interested in such things. And Tutson was haunted by the event that happened in the morning, when Theodore, with a grin on his face, said that he was taking Judith. Tutson was still clenching his fists in anger. He threw his hand forward, and a magical blue shield opened in front of him. And he thought with annoyance that the asshole Theodore was doing whatever he wanted with Judith. Suddenly, a black bird appeared in the sky. She caught Tutson's attention, and the bird quickly descended towards him. Tutson put out his hand, and the black dove sat on it. It had a message in its beak. Tutson read it, and his eyes widened from the message he received. Meanwhile, Theo brought Judith to his room and laid the sleeping girl on the bed. He also stayed next to her. He watched her sleep peacefully, her eyelashes trembling in her sleep. Her head rested on his chest. The girl was sleeping, and he guarded her sleep and thought that this was some kind of torture, just lying there and not daring to touch her. Judith stirred. She muttered that she was cold. Theodore thought that seeing her like this wasn't so bad. He pressed her closer to him to keep her warm and whispered that it was so difficult for him to restrain himself, and asked her to wake up faster, and she seemed to hear his call. Her eyelids fluttered, and she opened her eyes slightly and looked at him with a sleepy look. But the next moment, the drowsiness disappeared, and she pressed herself into the pillows, not understanding what was happening. Theodore hovered over her, looking at her, and then, in a hoarse voice, he asked how she slept. But at that moment, there was a knock on the door, and the butler reported that Lord Two-King, the owner of the magic tower, wanted to see His Majesty on an important issue. Judith was afraid that Tutson would see her in this position, but when he burst into the room and asked if she was okay, Judith had already jumped to her feet and, straightening her skirt, smilingly assured him that everything was fine. Theo was less happy to see him. He dryly asked what this important issue was for which he had come. Tutson glanced sideways at him. He wondered why this bastard was lying on the bed. It was quite suspicious. But he duly reported to the emperor that a chimera had been discovered this morning in the forests on the western part of the island. He conveyed the message that he received by carrier pigeon to the emperor and added that one was killed right on the spot and the second managed to escape. She is now being sought. The emperor's face became concentrated, and this said that everything was serious. She listened carefully to their conversation. Theo asked how the search is going, and she thought that in the world of the novel, There is only one person who knows how to deal with this. And this is the second prince believed to be dead. The main villain and his supporter is Iard. The second prince of the Valdemar Empire is Iard Asvin le Valdemar. He was the illegitimate son of the previous emperor. However, unlike Theo, who inherited the power of the royal family, Iard was an ordinary person. His mother wanted to make her son heir to the throne, and used many rituals of black magic on him. After such a difficult childhood, Iard's spirit was broken, and after the death of his cruel mother, all his anger turned to Theo. He thought that Theo would get everything he lacked without any effort, because he was lucky at birth. Iard devoted himself to researching chimeras in order to gain the power of the dragon. However, Theo discovered his work on black magic, and Iard set the palace on fire. He destroyed all his research and disappeared without a trace. And Theo was undeservedly left with the stigma of a tyrant who falsely accused and killed his younger brother. Judith sadly thought that I still felt a little sorry for Iard. Anyone unfortunate enough to grow up in such an environment would become evil. She remembered that when she was still Yoo Hye Sung, she had an inferiority complex. But now, she looked at two men discussing the current situation. Tutsun bowed his head and said that since His Majesty needs to pay close attention to even the insignificant affairs of the empire, from this day on, he would like to begin to see His Majesty more often in order to dedicate him to everything that is happening. Judith thought that her family was nothing but trouble. The men exchanged pleasantries. Theo said that he was impressed by Tukin's dedication, and Tutsun replied that he appreciated recognition of his value. But lightning flashed between them. Then Tutsun said that it was too late, so he would take his sister and they would go home. Judith smiled at Theo and promised that she would visit him tomorrow. But Theo was so amazed by Tutsun's impudence that he couldn't even utter a word, and Judith thought that tomorrow she would need to console him. When they got into the carriage, Tutsun asked Judith what Tutsun told her. What should she do if a suspicious bastard tries to touch you? Judith thought for a moment and then replied that she should blow his head up with magic. Tuqing gathered all his composure and patiently explained that he said that it would be safer to tear it into pieces. And then, when he's writhing in pain, hit him in the face with your elbow. Judith smiled at Tutsun, but she hoped that he wouldn't take her from the palace like that every day. That evening at dinner, her father dispelled her hopes by saying that from that day on, he and her brother decided to pick her up from the royal palace every day at 5 in the evening. Judith was upset. As expected, this is how it will be. But she did not contradict and agreed to this condition. It's great, of course, that her family treats her differently than in her previous life, but this is too much. After talking with her father, Judith ate dinner. Because of the recent events that had fallen on her like a snowball, she was experiencing stress. And now, in order to somehow relieve the tension, she was thinking that after dinner, she should go look for chocolate cake, which always helped her. She did just that. It was already night outside, but the store signs were shining brightly with lights to indicate their signs. She got out of the carriage, and the coachman said that if she was caught, the Duke would curse, and asked her to quickly buy what she needed and return home. Judith reassured him that if she was caught, the responsibility would be entirely hers, and she thanked the faithful servant for helping her. She entered the candy store and began to look around. All the shelves were filled with a variety of sweet treats, but Judith was interested in one thing, a limited edition of chocolate buns from the Camilla Bakery, and she was happy to note that they were here. The girl carefully put them in the packaging box, glad that they had not run out, because it was already so late. But she was lucky. She was already going to the checkout to pay for her purchase, when suddenly the door swung open and a man entered the store. He caught Judith's attention. He was tall and of a thin build. He was wearing a black cape with a hood that hid the half of his face. Jet black strands of hair fell onto his face, hiding it from prying eyes. The man was approaching quickly. He clearly looked at Judith as if he was interested in her, but said nothing. She had already approached the counter and felt his gaze. He seemed to be looking at her. The girl thought, why is he looking so strange? Was this the first time I saw a beautiful girl? At that moment, the stranger approached, and throwing several gold coins on the counter, said that he would pay for Judith's goods. This surprised her even more. Judith thought that he was in love with her. She smiled and waved her hand in protest and tried to refuse such courtesy, but he did not listen to her, but silently took her package and walked away from the candy store. And Judith, amazed by his behavior, froze in place. But the next moment she realized that he had taken her cake, the last thing left in the store. The girl rushed after him, She called out to him and said that she was the first to take these buns. And running up to him, she grabbed him by the cape and demanded that he give it to her. The man stopped and froze for a second, and then he turned and looked at Judith. The hood slid off his head, and the gaze of amethyst eyes glared into her. He was handsome, and there was something else about him that she couldn't understand. She still stood and looked at him intently. And the young man, putting the hood back on his head, told her that she could just take them and then change her mind about buying and leave. And narrowing his eyes, he added that whoever bought them got the buns. Judith tried to smile and thought that he might be handsome, but he was acting like a freak. And she said that there are rules of etiquette, but the guy turned out to be no mistake. He retorted that isn't it rude to grab someone and then yell at them? Judith was annoyed. She raised her hand and clenched her fist, intending to tell him everything she thought about him. But the guy suddenly grabbed her wrist and said that if she wants them so badly. He fell silent and paused. Judith watched as he stroked her palm with a long finger and said that maybe she should ask differently. He leaned towards her face so close that she felt his breath on her cheek and whispered that she could ask so that he would want to give them to her. Judith felt like she was struck by lightning. His dirty hints made me sick, and she thought that he must have gone completely crazy. She suddenly pulled her hand away and screamed that she could say whatever came into her head, and she kicked the guy. The next moment, such pain pierced her leg that tears almost came to her eyes. The girl thought that he probably had a metal plate on his leg. She was in so much pain. Judith decided to run away before he got angry and turned around and threw it after him so that he could choke on his chocolate buns. The stranger stood and silently watched the fleeing girl. He didn't try to stop her. He thought for a while, and his thoughts were about whether this was really the emperor's wife. He walked silently along the night street. Apparently, he had something to think about. His path lay in the pub, and soon he came to it. Walking inside, he caught the eye of a man standing behind the counter, polishing his glass. Behind him there was a fire burning over which a pot was hanging. The room was cozy and warm. The man greeted him by saying, "Welcome back, Mr. Iard," and the guy returned his greeting. Iard took off his cape and handed it to the approaching man, and he, in turn, noticed that judging by the fact that Iard was smiling, it means everything went according to plan. But Iard, sitting down at the table, said that not really. He thought that she would turn out to be a stupid girl who would be easy to deal with, but it turned out not quite so. The man carefully caught every word said by Iard, and he continued saying that he would have to seduce her in some other way so that she would bring Verdi. And when Iard finished, he said that he understood, and handing him the package, said that it was in his cape and asked what to do with it. Iard looked closely at the package that Judith was supposed to buy and said that he no longer needed it. He could throw it away. The day after this incident, Judith, as promised, went to visit the emperor. They were sitting in a large hall. Theo was sitting at the table, sorting out papers, and Judith was reading a book nearby. He took the next piece of paper and looked at it reluctantly. There was absolutely no desire to work. Thoughts about Judith were spinning in my head. She sat in front of him and quietly read a book, turning the pages from time to time. Theo furrowed his brows. It seemed to him that she wanted to play, that she was lonely, and so he put all the papers aside and got up from the table. Judith noticed this and asked if he had finished his business. Theo ruffled his hair and replied that not yet, just a little tired. Judith looked at him. She suggested that if he was tired, wouldn't it be better to lie down and rest? Work is, of course, important, but if from overwork. He approached her and asked if she really thought so, and Judith smiled and replied that yes, and she thought that if Theo went to bed, she would be more comfortable. But Theo, without thinking twice, lay down on the couch on which Judith was sitting and put his head on her feet. The girl thought that she did not feel any better. She carefully asked if he was comfortable, but he replied that he was not at all comfortable. Judith wondered if he was trying to tease her. She looked at Theo from above, and noticing his not happy expression on his face, she noticed that today he looked tired, but she asked him about what he couldn't sleep at night. And Theo raised his head and looked at her and replied that it was so. The girl seriously asked why. If he is too busy with work and does not have time to sleep, then this will not work. She stated that they should finish for today. Theo glanced at her. It was impossible to understand what he was thinking at that moment. The next moment, he reached out and stroked her cheek. It was such a gentle and pleasant touch. Theo thought about what he should wear to his next meeting with her. What should he do to please her? He had no idea what kind of food she liked. He wondered how wonderful her laughter would sound from his stories. And he said with a grin that all night in his head there were only thoughts about tomorrow. He stroked her cheek again and said that there were so many things he wanted to share with her. And all these thoughts keep him awake at night. Judith was pleased by his confession, and her cheeks turned red with embarrassment. She removed his hand, thinking about whether this was really his first relationship, and she invited him to gradually do everything he was thinking about. She said that His Majesty and she, but did not have time to finish. Theo grabbed her hand, and the next moment he brought it to his lips and planted a kiss on it. He covered her palm with kisses, and meanwhile said that he wanted to hug her. Judith turned crimson from embarrassment. She thought that in the novel everything was completely wrong, and she blurted out that she needed to prepare herself mentally. Theo was surprised by her words, and Judith released her hand and said that he was probably tired, and so she suggested we talk after he slept. Theo began to protest that he was already awake, but Judith insisted and said that poor sleep is bad for your health, and then he gave up and, closing his eyes, began to doze off almost immediately. Judith looked at the sleeping Teodoro and thought that it wasn't that she didn't like him. He's handsome, with a great body, and surprisingly, kind. All this is enough to please, but she was embarrassed that he was so infatuated with her. They met quite recently. It's not very cool if he's obsessed just because she's his first girlfriend. Of course they met by chance. And if Cern appears, they will soon separate. But while they are still together, I would like to maintain good relations. And if one day Theo fell in love with Cerna, Judith hoped that he would not hate her enough to kill her. Can she hope for such luck? The girl continued to look at the sleeping emperor and caught herself thinking that he was like an angel. Suddenly, one detail caught her eye. Judith noticed what looked like a ring on Theo's neck. The girl wondered if this happened in the original novel. She wanted to look at him closer. She couldn't decide whether she could do this. To do this, you will need to unbutton at least one more button on his shirt. But curiosity got the better of her, and Judith took hold of the top button, trying to unbutton it and not disturb Theo. She prayed that he wouldn't wake up at that moment. But Theo just now opened his eyes and met the sleepy gaze of Judith bending over him. There was bewilderment and question in his eyes. Judith panicked. She lifted her hands from his shirt and thought with horror that it looked like she was going to undress him. The next second, Theo stood up from her lap, turned to Judith, and took her by the shoulders and laid her on the sofa. Judith didn't have time to come to her senses before he was already on top. The girl could only intuitively press her hands to her chest. Meanwhile, Theo began to unbutton the buttons on his shirt. He looked at her and smiled and asked that she had already prepared. Judith realized that Theo had misunderstood her, and it was necessary to stop him before everything went too far. The girl put her hands on his chest and began to protest, pushing him away. She screamed that she didn't want it like that. Theo froze in bewilderment. He didn't understand why Judith was pushing him away. She turned away and quietly said that she did not like only physical relationships. Theo countered that he really liked her, but Judith objected that he only liked her body. Theo leaned over her again, and Judith rested her hands on his chest. He asked if she really thought that he only liked her body, but she was so engrossed in touching his muscular chest that she barely heard what he asked. Theo interpreted her silence in his own way. He sat down next to her, and Judith also sat down, straightened her dress, and said that in general she would like to know more about His Majesty. And looking at the sad Theo, she suggested that he take his time. She bowed her head awaiting his decision, but he called her name and said that she could just say no. Judith raised her head and looked at him. Theo looked at her too. His gaze was clear and his voice was calm. He said he wouldn't do anything she didn't like, and then he apologized for being in a hurry. Judith saw his hand in front of her. She didn't quite understand what he wanted. And then Theo asked Princess Judith if he could take her hand. Her surprise turned to amusement, and she laughed at how nicely Theo was looking after her. She extended her hand to him and placed it in his outstretched palm. Their fingers intertwined. Theodore squeezed her hand tighter and looked at her tenderly. He said that he would like to ask her for something. The girl looked into his amethyst eyes, and he said that he was inviting her to join him in the competition. The carriage with the driver was driving along the pavement. It was the Duke of Fergra Green's carriage. Judith was riding in it. She sat thinking about the invitation the Emperor had given her, about the hunting competition. She used to skip them every year so as not to meet Theo, but now he won't mind if she leaves. She was not traveling alone in the carriage. This time, her father picked her up at 5 o'clock as agreed. And now, looking closely at his daughter, he noticed her confusion and asked that the Emperor was not forcing her to do anything. He didn't have time to finish saying that if she doesn't like something, then she shouldn't force herself. Judith waved her hands furiously, making it clear that he was doing no such thing. She remembered his touchingly caring, gentle look and thought that he listened to her more than she expected. Judith was slightly embarrassed, but still told her father that moreover, since His Majesty and she still did not know each other well enough, she decided that communication would be paramount at their meetings. Smiling, she assured her father that he should not worry so much, and she added that if something happens, her father will be the first to know about it, and His Majesty will scold him. The Duke listened to his daughter, but he looked sad. He thought that he had worried in vain. Although he didn't like the Emperor, it was still Judith's decision, and as her father, he should have respected him. Therefore, in the end, he said that of course she could cope with everything. He kept forgetting that his daughter was already such an adult. Judith, in turn, said that they all, her father and brothers, were so worried about her, and it was so touching that tears came to the Duke's eyes. He thought that when did she learn to care so much about her father's feelings? The Duke remembered his wedding and thought that he now understood how his father-in-law felt when he and Layla got married. A smile touched his lips, and his gaze filled with warmth. The Duke remembered his wife Layla. He looked at Judith and seemed to want to talk to Layla. Tell them that their daughter is already such an adult. These were hunting competitions organized by the Imperial Palace, one of the annual events designed to maintain harmonious relations between the imperial family and the nobility. The most successful hunter was considered the winner. Before the competition, women gave a kiss to the participants to wish them good luck and a safe return. And among men, there was a custom to pick a bouquet of flowers during a hunt and confess to the lady you liked. Therefore, the event is very popular among boys and girls. Judith was restless before going to bed. She was haunted by the thought that the Emperor asked her to take part in such a competition. She imagined Theo with a bouquet of flowers and asked herself the question that he really wanted to give her flowers. She buried her face in the pillow and thought that she was a little embarrassed to publicly announce their relationship, and she also thought that she would need to kiss him for good luck. And before the girl's eyes, a picture appeared of her kissing Theo. This caused so much excitement that the girl thought that all this time her head had been filled with thoughts of a safe separation from Theo that she had completely forgotten. The girl remembered that in her past life she had never had a relationship. She devoted all her time to studying. In fact, Theo will be her first boyfriend. When she realized this, she began to be hysterical that he was her boyfriend. And she is the beloved of the Emperor, about whom she read so much. She couldn't believe the reality of what was happening. How did this happen? A blush of embarrassment flooded her face. She felt hot, and she said that she could not calm down. And then I thought that I wanted to see the expression on Theo's face at the upcoming competition, and while the sun had not yet set, she again decided to go for a walk and get some fresh air. And no matter how the good old coachman tried to dissuade her, she still insisted on her own, and they went to the pastry shop again. Judith was convinced that sweets were the best way to escape from all worries. So she was again in the pastry shop, where they sold her favorite buns. Today there are quite a lot of them left, and Judith's eyes lit up with a greedy fire. She remembered that last time she lost her last buns because of that man in black, and so she decided that today she would take everything. She thought that she would buy enough to share with her family and the people of the duchy. The girl was so carried away that the buns barely fit into the bag, and it was quite difficult for her to carry this burden that Judith even doubted whether she had gone too far. It was quickly getting dark outside, and when Judith approached the carriage, she realized that she didn't have enough hands to open the door. She looked around. Jason, the coachman, usually waited for her in front of the carriage. Maybe he's in the coachman's place? She called to him to help her open the door. The girl did not see that a man was watching her from behind. He came up and helped open the door, asking her to come in. Judith thanked him, and he said that he had not done anything special. She entered the carriage, and the man stood and watched her, pulling his hat tighter so that a shadow fell on his face. As soon as Judith sat down, the carriage immediately started moving, and she drove away. But after some time, she wondered why the carriage was shaking so much. The girl thought that they were really going to the wrong place. At that moment, the carriage stopped, and a few moments later the door opened. Judith wondered if they were already there. And without leaving, she asked Jason why they arrived so quickly. But someone else's voice said that that coachman was most likely somewhere in the warehouse now. And a man appeared in the doorway and helped her open the door. He apologized and said that he was not the one she was looking for. Judith was indignant that he was the one from before, but didn't finish. The thought flashed through her mind that this was an elaborate kidnapping. She did not move, and the man also still stood in the doorway of the carriage. Judith asked him why all this. Maybe he needs money? But the man said that she had no need to know the details of their plan, and a blue magical flame flared up on his palm. And with the words that she just needed to sit silently for a while, he directed a stream of this flame at her. Judith screamed, and she closed her eyes expecting a magical blow. But for some reason, it didn't come. Somehow, the entire stream absorbed the shield that Judith learned to put up with her brother Tutson. And when she opened her eyes, she realized what was happening. Her magic worked at just the right moment. But the thief froze. He didn't understand what was going on. He remembered that magic had definitely hit her. Why is she okay? And while he stood there in bewilderment, Julia thought that she didn't know why he decided to kidnap her. But now was her chance. She intensely recalled how she trained with her brothers. Judith was sure that there was some kind of magic that could be used in such a situation. You just need to remember. She remembered how she asked Tutson to tell her about the magic with which you can win with one blow. He was surprised, and she explained to him that it should be something that could be learned quickly and effortlessly. Tutson answered her that for this, you need to be a genius like him. Judith was upset and said that then everything was in vain. She still had no talent. But Tutson asked her not to rush, and he added that in any case, what she needs is the magic of self-defense. He thought for a moment, and then said that instead of strong magic, how about a quick and safe way to take your opponent by surprise? A pink light appeared in her hand. Yes, this is lightning magic. Judith thought that lightning magic was so fast that it was difficult to aim. She hesitated a little, and the kidnapper noticed that she also had magic. He exclaimed that he couldn't believe she could do this. Judith remembered how her brother instructed her to attack when the enemy was close to her, and she directed streams of lightning directly at him. The kidnapper did not expect this. He could not defend himself, and therefore the magic of lightning struck him, causing his body to shudder from electrical discharges. He fell to the floor. Pink discharges were still passing through his body. Judith got up from her chair and tried to walk around him. She looked out the door onto the street and thought about running while he was unconscious. It was dark outside. The area was unfamiliar. She was among the same type of houses. Lights were burning in the windows of some of them, casting a faint light on the road. Judith did not understand where she was and where to go. Suddenly, someone pounced on her from behind and covered her mouth with his hand so that she could not scream or call for help. Judith couldn't believe it, but it was a bully who kidnapped her. He said that it couldn't be, and he would never have thought that she had magic. He ordered her to be silent and not move, otherwise he would break her thin arms. Judith became scared. She mentally called out to her father and brothers for help. She wanted to scream for someone to come to her aid. Judith didn't know why, but suddenly the kidnapper's grip began to weaken, and she felt him fall. And while he was defeated, she started to run, not knowing where to hide from this pursuer. But before she had time to take even a couple of steps, she buried her nose in another person. Judith raised her head and looked in fear at the one in whose hands she fell this time. The man asked if she was hurt? The girl's surprise knew no bounds. She knew the man who stood in front of her and carefully supported her waist so that she would not fall. The girl asked what he was doing here. He playfully indignant that this is all she can say when she meets a familiar face. But Judith still did not back down. She asked him again, how did he end up here? Then she turned and looked back, and she asked with alarm, "Who is that man?" The kidnapper continued to lie on the ground and did not move. But her acquaintance in a black cape reassured her that he was simply passed out and added that he would wake up soon. Then he looked at her and asked that she was really unhappy and needed to kill him. Judith was shaking from nervous tension, but she tried to pull herself together and thanked the stranger for his help. She also added that she would repay the favor when she returned to the Duchy of Fergra. Iard stood and looked at her in bewilderment. It was unclear whether he was offended by her words or something else. But in the end, he turned away, and about to leave, asked if she could get there on her own. To which Judith replied in the affirmative. But he looked at her skeptically and said that she didn't know the way, and without waiting for her answer, he ordered her to follow him. Judith was curious why he was suddenly so kind. She would have liked to refuse, but she was afraid to be here alone. But she was afraid to go with him too. In the end, she followed him, but warned that if he took her to some strange place, she would scream. But Iard said that if he wanted to do something with her, he would have already done it. Judith thought he was right. He helped her, but in such a situation, can you rely on him? She still decided to thank him again for saving her. She followed him and continued to say that, to tell the truth, she was a little scared, and she's still angry with him for last time. Fatigue overcame her. Judith even closed her eyes. It seemed easier to walk. Iard glanced sideways at her and glanced furtively. And Judith, not noticing his inquisitive gaze, continued her monologue that since he had done her a favor, she would definitely thank her if he visited the Duke's residence tomorrow. He said without excessive sentimentality that everything was fine. You can do without obsessive gratitude. But Judith insisted. She would not like to remain in debt, but he answered sharply that he did not need anything. And after a pause, he added that if she was grateful, then he asked her to stop insisting. And wouldn't it be more polite to visit him in person? Judith was infuriated by his tone and himself, but she had nothing to object to. And she blurted out that he should tell him where he lived, and then she would come with a lot of gold. But he replied that this did not suit him either. Judith was confused. She was ultimately forced to say that whatever she wanted, let her do what she wanted. His behavior was intolerable. And suddenly, iard stopped and said that maybe at their next meeting she would bring chocolate buns from that store? This surprised her at first, but then she began to get angry again and thought that he must really like chocolate buns. Meanwhile, iard stopped and said that he would not accompany her further. Judith looked around. They reached the square. There were lights burning everywhere here, and it wasn't so scary. He said that he hoped the princess would be able to get to the carriage on her own. But Judith was so angry that she rudely replied that she could cope without him. And she wished him not to worry and to go where he was going. She turned and walked away. It seemed that she was about to boil over the fact that, in her opinion, it was incredible stupidity to even consider him a good person for a moment. But after a moment, her mood changed, and she thought that she should have at least asked his name. She turned to ask, but there was no one in that place, near the arch. It was as if she had imagined it all. Judith was upset and sad. She didn't even have time to say goodbye. A little later, her father and brothers took her. They were seriously scared for her. The missing Jason was found safe and sound in the warehouse. They tied him up, and he lay there until they found him. Theo combed the entire empire in search of her kidnapper, but found no one. Thanks to her tearful pleas, Jason was not fired, but his salary was reduced, and she was forbidden to leave the mansion for some time. Judith buried her head in her pillow and thought that she was so sorry for Jason. It was she who made him come with her. And while she was forbidden to leave, she would not be able to get into the Camilla bakery. She also thought about the fact that the man in the black cape. Judith hoped that he was not waiting for her. Iard, meanwhile, was walking down the alley. A dog barked and howled after him, as if the animals sensed the danger emanating from him. He approached a cage with a large lion. It was Shran. That's what Iard called him. He extended his hand through the bars of the cage behind which the beast was and called him again. The animal obediently approached him, and iard stroked its face, looking into the yellow eyes of the animal. At that moment, someone called iard, and not only the man, but also the beast turned to this call. It was a woman. She had burgundy hair and amethyst eyes. She said that, as he ordered, they dealt with the kidnappers. Iard, in turn, thanked her for a job well done, and that everything went well. But the woman replied that she did not deserve such praise, and they simply followed his plan. Iard walked past her, and she turned and said after him that that woman, as he said, could cancel magic spells. She asked if this was possible. Iard turned his head in her direction and said that in fact this was not a cancellation, but an absorption. She can interrupt an opponent's attack with her own magic, and he added that this is the ability of an extinct demonic race. There was a rumor that Duke Fergra and his eldest son possessed special powers that were passed down through the family with demonic abilities. And the daughter inherited the power of another demon. Iard turned to his faithful servant and ordered him not to take his eyes off her. And don't let yourself be discovered. And she humbly said that as he ordered. After that, Iard turned around and walked away. Left alone, his thoughts were occupied with the fact that the Emperor's beloved was a woman with unsurpassed magical abilities. His lips stretched into a smile, and he thought that his brother Theodore always managed to get what he wanted. The weather was beautiful outside. The sun was shining, and a light breeze was blowing. Therefore, Judith, who had been sitting hopelessly in the castle, experienced truly heavenly pleasure from finally getting out. Today, the hunting competition began. Suddenly, she heard a familiar voice. Judith looked in surprise at the man who called her. It was Emperor Theodore. He was incredibly handsome, but she was surprised that he arrived so early. He walked up to her and took her hand, and Judith asked why he had arrived so early, because usually the royal family was the last to arrive. Theo took her hand, brought it to his lips and kissed it. And then he said that he wanted to see her. This gesture made Judith feel embarrassed. And besides, her family was watching them, and such behavior on the part of the emperor did not particularly please them. She wanted to tell him that he was putting her in an awkward position because his person attracted everyone's attention. Judith called out to Brother Cain, and he turned to her. She approached him and said that the captain of the knights was leaving before everyone else, and kissed him on the cheek, asking him to be careful. And he responded by patting her on the head and asking her not to go far alone. Their father stood at a distance and coughed to attract attention. And Judith thought about the men in her family. Everyone demanded their share of attention. She walked up to him and offered his cheek for a kiss, telling him not to overdo it. And her father promised her this. As she saw her family off, her thoughts returned to Theo. She wondered who he was with now. She glanced at him. Theo stood alone and was busy with his bow. Judith was surprised that he was alone. And then I remembered that Theo's family died. The girl's heart sank because she realized how lonely he was, because he didn't have a single close person. She called out to him, and when he turned around, she made a sign for him not to make any noise. Theodore was confused. He asked what was going on, and Judith looked around uncertainly and asked that there was no one here. The emperor assured her that there was no one. She became embarrassed, and continuing to look around, said that she had come to bless him. Theo thought the blessing meant a kiss, and that meant that they had to kiss each other. He saw her embarrassment and indecisiveness, and therefore said that she should not repeat after the others. But Judith stood on her tiptoes and reached out to him and kissed him on the cheek. It was so nice that Theo was filled with tenderness. And Judith said that she did it because she wanted to, of her own free will, and not because custom required it. Theo stroked her face with his palm and ran his finger over her lips. He said that he could not even think that she would allow him to receive a blessing on her lips. Judith looked at him with all her eyes, and he leaned towards her with such tenderness that it seemed to the girl that she was about to begin to melt. She said hesitantly, "His Majesty," and at that moment, Theo barely audibly touched her slightly parted lips with his lips. Sensual pleasure filled the girl. Her chest became warm, her heart beat faster. She pulled away from him and said that it was just a blessing, and asked him not to misunderstand. Theo froze in place. This was the end of the fantasy. Judith thought that she had kissed him, but he was so cold. He took it and stood up like an idol, and she said that she would probably go. But Theo asked her to wait and turned the girl towards him and kissed her on the forehead. It was so unexpected. Judith was surprised, and although she didn't say anything, there was a question in her eyes. Theo raised his hand to his lips and said that this was also a blessing, and don't let her misunderstand. He turned away from the confused girl and thought he did a great job and praised himself. It's time to start the hunting competition. The flag was raised in the air, the bugle sounded. The horsemen set off at a gallop, riding in all directions. Noble ladies sat on a carpet under a tree in its shade. They were discussing who would win this year. Someone suggested that maybe it was His Majesty, and he added that this time he is with his lover. Judith was just approaching them and noticed that they were staring at her. Apparently, everyone was burning with curiosity about her and Theo. Judith already thought that she could say that she needed to go to the restroom and run away. But at that moment, one of the girls said that they were pleased to meet Miss Fergra. Standing in front of Judith was a tall, thin girl with long burgundy hair. She smiled and introduced herself. It was Isabella Leon. Judith was somewhat surprised. Is their first meeting with Isabella taking place here? Isabella Leon was the henchwoman of the villainous Judith. In the novel, Isabella had feelings for Theo, and she was jealous of Judith, his fiancée. Skillfully playing on Isabella's love, Judith used it against Serna. But the fair Serna saved Isabella's life when she was on the verge of death. Isabella, touched by her action, became Serna's closest friend. In short, there may be betrayal in the future of his relationship with Isabella. Judith smiled and warmly replied that she was pleased to meet you, but she thought to herself that nothing good would come of their friendship, and therefore Judith would keep her distance. But Isabella said that she really wanted to meet her, and she asked that if Judith didn't mind, then she wanted to send her an invitation to the next tea party. Judith wanted to scream that no, there was no need to send anything, but outwardly she smiled and politely said that of course, and if nothing important happened, then she would definitely try to come. They approached everyone and also took places on the mat. Isabella asked Judith what drink she had brought with her and said that she had flower tea. Judith was depressed that Isabella sat next to her. She didn't answer. But the girl did not lag behind Judith and invited her to try her flower tea, adding that it could only be found in the jungle in the southwest of the continent. And when Judith thanked her and was about to take the cup, she trembled in Isabella's hand. And the next moment, its contents spilled onto Miss Leon's dress. This attracted the attention of the others. Everyone fussed around them asking if everything was okay. Were you worried that the tea was probably hot? Did she get burned? Judith looked at all this fuss and thought that Isabella spilled tea on herself on purpose. And then Isabella said that she was fine and turned to Judith and said that apparently Miss Judith's hand trembled. Such impudence stunned Judith. She looked searchingly at her counterpart, wanting to ask what she wanted to say, that it was all Judith's fault, but she only brazenly smiled back at her. Judith wanted to beat her, but the next moment she stopped herself, not having the desire to get involved with the villainess. She forced herself to smile calmly, as befits a noble lady, and turning to Isabella, she looked her up and down as if to say that she would not remain silent, and said that she was behaving like a child. But Isabella in turn flushed and asked defiantly what Judith meant. At that moment, a familiar voice came from behind Judith, and everyone became silent for a moment. It was the Emperor, and someone said that we welcome the inexorable son of the Valdemar Empire. Judith turned around, and the Emperor was indeed standing in front of her. He said that he had come for her, and a little later, he added that they were going on a picnic. The girl asked that he wasn't going to the competition, but Theo bowed his head and sadly said that if he goes, he won't have time left to be with her, and there will be no picnic. He extended his hand to her and said that he wanted to show her something. Judith hesitated and asked him to wait. She thought it would be rude to just leave now. She turned to the other ladies and, apologizing, said that she was embarrassed to have to leave them so suddenly. But the girls replied that it was okay, and they could continue their conversation next time. Theo stood behind her, and his mood became gloomy. The girls, seeing his condition, wanted to tell Lady Fergra to leave quickly, otherwise His Majesty's mood would deteriorate even more. And when Theo and Judith, holding hands, began to move away, everyone silently looked after them. And then the gossip began. Isabella sat on the rug and heard others say that obviously Lady Fergra is the Emperor's beloved, isn't it? On the other hand, the girl replied that she had not seen His Majesty behave so kindly to anyone. But when Isabella heard that perhaps they would all soon hear news of their wedding, she clutched the fabric of her skirts. Apparently, this was unpleasant for her. Meanwhile, Theo and Judith were walking through the park. Judith thought about how the Emperor's presence had such a strong impact. Everyone is afraid of him. She remembered Isabella and noted that she seemed upset, although she was the first to start a quarrel with Judith. She turned her gaze to the Emperor, and looking at him, thought that now he did not seem like a tyrant. He looked at her and smiled, and Judith thought again that it was good that he was on her side. They walked hand in hand, and she was filled with a feeling of security. Theo squeezed her hand, and Judith was pleased. She looked at him once again and asked if everything would be all right. They say the hunting festival is a friendly competition between the imperial family and the nobility, but if he's here with her... But Theo interrupted her and assured her that there was nothing to worry about. He works hard to strengthen their friendship. At the same time, he raised their clasped hands, thereby indicating that he meant her and himself. Judith found herself thinking that every time she looked at him, she remembered their first night. A blush appeared on her face, and she turned her face away from him. She asked what he was going to show her. Theo replied that they were almost there and asked her to look in the direction where he was pointing his hand. Before my eyes stretched a clearing covered with lilac flowers. It was such an indescribable beauty that Judith didn't even believe it right away. She exclaimed in delight that she did not know such a place existed. Theo looked at her childish delight and asked if she liked it. Judith said that it was very beautiful and clapped her hands with joy. She walked forward through the flower meadow, and Theo walked behind and said that at first he wanted to pick a bouquet for her, but then he decided that a few flowers would not be enough. Judith spread her arms and spun around, asking what is all this flower field for her. Theo looked at her lovingly. Didn't she understand how much he loved her? And when Judith approached him, he said that if she wanted, he would give her the entire empire instead of an ordinary field of flowers. It was a confession. Judith thought that when you meet the Emperor, the scale of confessions changes. Sparkles of joy shone in her eyes, but the entire empire would be too much of a burden for her, and she replied that flowers were enough for her. Theo thought about it and said that his beloved was devoid of greed. But Judith thought it was because she shouldn't get attached to him. The girl thought that she needed to change the topic until he started asking her to get married again. She wondered what she could say or ask to distract Theo's attention. And at that moment, she noticed the shine of the ring that hung on his neck. She couldn't believe he wore it all the time. Judith asked if she could look at the chain he had around his neck. The girl looked at him pleadingly and said that it was nothing, she just looked like one thing she knew. And Theo agreed. He released the chain from under his clothes and took hold of the clasp to unfasten it. The emperor held out a chain with a ring and placed it on Judith's palm. The girl looked at him and couldn't believe her eyes. It was the same ring that she lost as a child. Why did Theo have it? Judith looked at him and asked how he got this ring. She thought it was impossible that she and Theo. He looked at her confused and asked what she really didn't remember. And then he said that she gave it to him 14 years ago. Judith was stunned. She didn't remember such a plot in the original novel. Did she really know Theo as a child? That's why he was kind to her in their first meeting. But why didn't she remember anything? She hesitantly asked if he was sure that she gave him this ring. And she asked him to tell her where he found it. Theodore became serious and said that she gave him a ring and asked him to marry her. His answer simply shocked her. Judith didn't think he was lying to her. But what could happen then? Theodore looked at her silently, and then he said that he had been waiting for her all this time. He saw that she had forgotten what was always stored in his memories, and Judith looked at him with all her eyes. Theo said that he always seems to think about her before going to bed. He worries whether she is comfortable, whether she ate well. He hoped to meet her by chance. That's why he went to all those boring balls. Judith squeezed her hand, and he said that he was looking for her. Theo placed his hand over hers and asked her not to try to deny his proposal, even if she didn't remember it. He said that he had no intention of letting her go. Judith looked at his excited face and thought that the reason Theo kept the ring was because he was looking for her. No more Serna. Only Judith, who had no name and no identity. She was just a little girl. Judith felt a surge of happiness, and then she asked him to keep this ring as proof that she proposed to him. She knew that his love for her might change one day. She smiled and reached towards him to place the chain around his neck. She really wanted to trust him. They returned to camp. A knight was waiting near the imperial tent. When they noticed him, Judith stopped and said that she would return to the ladies and asked him to be careful. He apologized, but apparently something important had happened. He leaned towards her and pressed a kiss to her forehead. Theo said that he is the happiest man in the empire because he has such an understanding woman. He thanked her and asked her to also be careful and think about him. He left her and went to the waiting knight, and Judith followed him with her gaze. She walked through the forest and thought that at first this relationship was a burden, but now it seemed sweet to her. Suddenly, her attention was attracted by the figure of a man who was making his way through the forest. At first she thought that someone was lost, but then she noticed a familiar dress, and she realized that it was Isabella. She walked through the forest. On her dress there was the same stain from spilled tea, and she was angry at Judith, thinking about what hole she had crawled out of and how dare she behave like that. She remembered how His Majesty looked at Judith and thought that she behaved this way on purpose in front of the emperor. Isabella kicked a pebble that lay in her path. How this situation infuriated her. The stone hit the animal's paw and fell to the ground. Isabella stopped. She was alerted by a strange sound, and then a huge monster appeared out of nowhere right in front of her. It was a huge three-headed black wolf. The eyes on their heads glowed with yellow fire, and he looked at Isabella and growled, preparing to attack. The girl couldn't even move from horror. The thought was racing through her head. What is this? And suddenly, the beast let out a long roar. He was so powerful that Isabella covered her ears with her hands and turned away, not wanting to look at this monster anymore. At that moment, she heard a familiar voice that commanded her to step aside. It was Judith who directed a golden beam of protective magic at the monster. The three-headed monster was engulfed in flames. He growled and squirmed, and Isabella was shaking from the fear she experienced. She seemed numb, unable to move while the monster moaned and wriggled in front of her. And when the monster collapsed to the ground, the girl began to tremble violently. She had never experienced such horror. Judith ran up to her and asked if everything was okay. Isabella looked at her as if she was seeing her for the first time, and then she stammered Judith's name, as if she couldn't believe that she was seeing her in front of her. Judith looked at the monster's body lying on the ground and thought that Isabella was in danger, so she used magic, although she had doubts about success. But apparently the special lessons with Brother Tutson were not in vain. He remembered his cocky brother. Judith leaned over to Isabella and asked if she could get up. We had to hurry to get out of here before this beast came to its senses. But she did not notice that a whole flock of black animals with burning eyes was already gathering around them. Judith was horrified that there were so many of them. The girls sat and silently watched as mutant wolves converged on the three-headed monster from all sides. Judith said that why the hell did the chimeras even forget here? And Isabella sat with her eyes wide and, as if mute, watched all this. Judith rose to her feet and thought that it seemed that the two of them could not get out of here. She did not take her eyes off the chimeras, and at the same time asked if Isabella could escape. The girl explained that she would use magic and distract the monsters. Therefore, as soon as Judith gives the signal, Isabella will have to run. But Isabella replied that she would not be able to run, since the wolves would immediately chase her. Judith looked at the girl. She sat on the ground and trembled. Judith said that she understands that she is scared, but now is not the time. Isabella sat with her eyes downcast. She seemed to be deliberately not looking at Judith, as if she was hiding something. Judith asked what she wasn't saying, and then Isabella stuttered and said that she just wanted... She wondered if His Majesty would come to the rescue if she was in danger. At the same time, the girl began to wrinkle the fabric of her skirt with special zeal. She continued by saying that that is why she prepared a hallucinogenic tea that affects animals. She paused, and then admitted that she deliberately spilled it on herself. And Judith remembered the morning incident. Judith gasped. Because of this stupidity, they were both now in terrible danger. Even though Isabella swore that she knew absolutely nothing about these monsters, Judith could not restrain herself and asked that Isabella was a complete fool? What was she thinking about exposing herself to such danger? The animals were getting closer. Now it becomes clear why they behave like zombies. It was necessary to act immediately. Judith turned to Isabella, and realizing that now was not the time to argue, apologized and grabbed the fabric where the stain was and pulled with all her might. Isabella only had time to exclaim and ask what Judith was doing, but she was already standing with a torn piece of material and saying that without it, the chimeras would not pay any attention to Isabella. Judith looked at her opponent and said that when she gives the sign, she should run, and as soon as she is safe, she should call the knights for help as quickly as possible. Isabella asked in confusion what would happen to Judith. If the fabric remains with her, then... She paused, not daring to even imagine how everything could turn out. But Judith did not lose her presence of mind, and wanting to cheer her up, smiled and told her not to worry. She is, after all, a student of the current owner of the tower, Lord Tutson. And she thought bitterly to herself that even though her talent had passed her by, she was still capable of something. The chimera wolves rushed towards them. Judith screamed for Isabella to run now and quickly, and the girl rushed to run with all her might, not making out the road, driven by the horror of what was happening. A few seconds later, behind her, up and to the sides, breaking through the foliage and branches, a stream of pink glow soared up. This stream of light frightened the birds, and they took to the air and flew away in a flock, as if fleeing from something. This attracted the attention of the emperor, who was still talking to the knight. At this time, Judith was sitting on the ground. Her palms touched the ground, and from them, a pink circle was outlined around her. It was a protective magic that protected her from chimeras, preventing them from passing through the glow. The animals saw the girl and smelled the hallucinogenic tea, but while the magic was working, they could not get closer, but they did not leave either. Judith strained her powers with all her might. The tension was growing. She wondered how much time had already passed. Barrier magic is very energy-consuming and cannot last long. She was tormented by doubts. Would Isabella really call the knights? What if he leaves her here to die? She saw that the chimeras were not leaving. What if her magical energy runs out before help arrives? Is she really going to die like this? The girl began to panic. She only cared about the ending in which she died at the hands of Theodore, like in the original novel. But I would never have thought that I could meet a different death. Will Theodore live a happy life with Cern following the story? Will she be remembered if she dies? Her energy began to weaken. The rays became weaker and more transparent. The glow was not so bright. Her strength was running out. Judith understood that the defense was disappearing, but she still continued to keep her hands on the ground, not knowing what else could be done. The beast growled, and this roar echoed through the forest, causing despair to take possession of the girl with renewed vigor. She wanted to scream that she didn't want to die here, but suddenly, from behind her, she heard a shout and an echo with her name echoed through the forest. At the same time, Arrows pierced the animal's paws, preventing them from approaching the girl. Judith looked in shock in the direction where the exclamation came from. She still didn't believe her eyes, but a feeling of joy already filled her soul. It was Theo. He rode on his horse, holding a bow in his hands. It was he who shot the arrows, wanting to protect her. He saw her helplessly sitting on the ground. Theo threw away his bow and uttered one word, "Rakion!" And at that very second, the magic sword was in his hand. It burned with a bright flame, as if a ray of sunlight was in the hands of the emperor. He looked like a ruler punishing evil. The faithful horse fearlessly rushed towards the monsters. Theo's eyes burned with righteous anger. He waved his sword, and rays of fiery light flew towards the flock of monsters, destroying everything in their path. Judith looked at what was happening with her eyes wide open in surprise. The power of the sword was indescribable, and all she could do was whisper that this was the same sword. The power of the imperial family that Theo possesses? Another moment, and he stopped next to her in an alarmed voice, asking if she was hurt? The girl didn't have time to answer anything before he grabbed her and wrapped her in his arms. Judith was amazed by the whirlpool of feelings that she experienced while in his arms. Fear receded, giving way to joy. It was safe in his arms. Judith tried to say something, but Theo hugged her tighter and sternly said that she should always think about herself and then about others. He said that every time she does that, does she know how much he... Theo trailed off, and the girl's eyes became wider and wider with realization. The fact that the tips of his fingers tremble from the nervous tension he has experienced. His voice seems ready to break at any moment. A hug squeezing her tightly, which clearly makes it clear that he is gripped by fear more than she is. Judith asked him to forgive her for making him worry. She hugged him back, letting the tension go away and relaxing in his arms, realizing that she was no longer in danger. They sat there in each other's arms for some time. Theo came to her. He saved her. And he found her again, after the chilling fear that he could lose her forever. Soon they returned to camp. People were waiting for their return. Excitement froze on their faces. Theo led Judith by the hand. As soon as Duke Fergret and his eldest son noticed them, they immediately rushed towards them, shouting her name along the way. They embraced her, and the father thanked His Majesty from the bottom of his heart for returning his daughter safe and sound. Theo said that there seemed to be no external injuries, but Judith was very scared, and he ordered the imperial doctor to examine her. He also turned to Sir Kane with an order to take the knights and find out how the chimeras got here. Judith looked at Theo. She did not dare to tell him about this whole story, or not to interfere and let everything go as it goes. But after a while, she and her family, as well as Miss Isabella, accompanied by her relatives, stood before the imperial tent and listened to the report of Lord Kane. The emperor ordered him to report. And then Kane said that traces had been discovered that chimeras had entered this place from territories outside the hunting grounds. It seems that the chimera running nearby was attracted here by the scent of the Raxus flower. Kane turned towards Isabella and said that as a result of the investigation, it was also possible to find out that the flower was found in the tea brought by Lady Lyon. At these words, Isabella pulled her head into her shoulders and seemed to become smaller in stature. She understood that interrogation awaited her. Theo thought about it. He remembered that Raxus flowers have a hallucinogenic effect that drives monsters and wild animals crazy. He looked at Isabella. His eyes burned with anger, and it seemed that the atmosphere around him was also heated to the limit. The emperor asked why she made tea from such a dangerous flower and brought it here. Then he turned to her father, the Marquis of Lyon, and asked if he knew anything about this, and demanding an answer from him for his daughter. The Marquis Lyon said with his hand on his heart that he was very sorry, but he believed that someone was planning to harm the daughter of His Majesty's humble servant. And he added for credibility that isn't his daughter the one who was attacked by the monsters? He bowed in respect and said that if His Majesty gives permission, he would like to put the honor of his family on the line, and personally find out who was behind the attempt to harm his daughter. But Theodore looked at this family with such distrust and contempt in his eyes that it seemed his anger knew no bounds. He was silent, and then Judith took his hand to try to somehow quench his anger. Theo instantly reacted to this gesture and looked at her. Their eyes met. They looked at each other silently for several seconds, and then Theo turned and said that he was giving his permission. After this, the tension subsided. Everyone began to disperse. The Marquis Lyon also went into his tent. He walked up to the table and rested his palms on it. Isabella stood behind him, awaiting her father's verdict. He tried to control his anger, But knowing his daughter, he understood that she could do such a thing. So he directly asked if this was her trick? Isabella hesitantly tried to start a conversation, but from her tone, he knew that she was to blame, and therefore flared up in anger. Marquis Leon shouted that the joke also has a limit. When will she finally grow up? He shouted that her childishness had almost ruined her little brother's future. He accused her of not only not being able to help, but also doing everything to fall out of favor with the emperor. In the end, he said that he would take care of it, and she should just keep her mouth shut. Isabella meekly agreed with her father. He couldn't look at her anymore, so he decided to leave the tent, calling her a stupid girl. When Isabella was left alone, she went to the wall and leaned on her hand. She heard someone's steps, and then a voice. It was Judith. She called out to Isabella and asked if she would like to talk a little about what happened earlier. And from this, Isabella clenched her fists. The girl slowly turned away from the wall, thinking about why Lady Pilgrim came to her. Is she going to interrogate her? But out loud, she politely asked what Lady Fergra wanted. Judith looked at her worriedly, and then asked if she was hurt. This question made Isabella ask irritably what she meant. And Judith, in turn, replied that Brother Cain said that her clothes and shoes were in terrible shape. Judith guessed that Isabella ran through the forest as fast as she could to call the knights, didn't she? And that's why she apparently got dirty. Judith, without waiting for an answer, approached Isabella, and taking her hands, began to thank her for her help, because that is why she managed to survive. Isabella, at such an unexpected turn of events, also opened her mouth to thank Judith in turn, but at that time someone called her. Judith turned to the girl and smilingly said that her family was calling her, so she was forced to leave Isabella. And finally, good-naturedly saying that today was a hard day, she advised me to go home and have a good rest. She also advised her never to start something so dangerous. Isabella promised her that she wouldn't do it again. Judith walked towards the exit of the tent, and Isabella stood and watched her. She was torn apart by a variety of emotions, but still, Lady Fergra's kindness won her over. The day was drawing to a close. All participants in the hunting competition slowly began to leave. Duke Fergret turned to Judith and, putting his arm around her shoulders, said that it was already getting dark, so it was time for them to return home. At that moment, Theodore called out to her and persistently asked her to wait. He quickly approached them. A few seconds later, he took her hand, and Judith asked in surprise what happened. And he smilingly said that he would accompany her to the carriage. He supported her by the waist, thereby wanting to be closer. Soon they were near the carriage, and Judith, who was sitting in it, looked at Theo through the window, and he looked at her sadly, because the hour of parting was approaching. Wanting to cheer him up, Judith waved her hand to him and said that they would meet tomorrow. Theo responded by wishing her good night and pleasant, sweet dreams. The carriage started taking away his beloved, and he continued to stand for some time, waving after her. But as soon as the carriage was out of sight, his gaze became gloomy. There was a lot to deal with. He returned to the camp where the knights were waiting for him. A flame was burning near them. The emperor immediately asked the question, did they manage to find out exactly where the chimeras entered? Lord Cain reported first. He said that they found traces of experiments with black magic near the northwestern border of the hunting grounds. The chimeras seemed to have escaped from there. The emperor immediately asked, what about the magicians who carried out the experiments? Cain replied that it seemed the magicians had left that place a long time ago. It was speculated that after they left, some hungry chimeras came down in search of food. All remaining chimeras were killed and their bodies burned. That was all he could say. Therefore, the emperor thanked him for his excellent work. Theodore thought for a while. The news that experiments with black magic were being conducted there did not give him peace, and he inaudibly pronounced the name of his brother Iard, realizing that this could not have happened without him. He looked at Cain, and after a pause, he still ordered him to try to find Iard. And although this came as a surprise to the latter, he did not show his surprise in any way. He only asked in a dispassionate voice that the emperor meant that the second prince was alive. Theo replied that 5 years ago, confirmation had arrived that he was heading to the Principality of Arsel through the western Elist. Recently, there have been many reports of the discovery of traces of experiments with black magic, and with such a scale, there must certainly be someone who will lead all these magicians. And after a couple of seconds, Theodore said that if Iard again began to gather supporters around himself, then he could not sit idly by. The emperor's gaze became sad. He hoped to the last that his brother had escaped to live a quiet life, forgetting about the imperial family. Cain asked what he would do if it was confirmed that the second prince was behind all this. The emperor was silent. Pictures of iard standing in front of him flashed before his eyes. He was stained with blood, his hands were covered in blood, and he begged for Theo to kill him. Theodore exhaled and said with a heavy heart that this time he would have to kill him. Meanwhile, night fell on the earth. Upon arriving home, Judith immediately went to bed and fell asleep. Her father was next to her all this time. The door opened, and Tutson appeared on the threshold. From the doorway, he asked if everything was okay with Judith, and he also asked me to explain how there were monsters at the hunting competitions of the imperial house, but his father turned to him and asked him to keep his voice down, otherwise they might disturb Judith's sleep, and then suggested that they talk outside. They sat in the dining room. The servant served them tea, and a conversation began between father and son. Duke Fergret, looking at his son, said that he thought it was better to remove the seal placed on Judith, and then asked what he thought about this. Such an unexpected turn surprised the Duke's youngest son. It was so unexpected that instead of answering, he asked why his father suddenly started talking about it. The Duke said sadly that he had been thinking about this since Judith was last kidnapped. This happened before they could find a new bodyguard for their baby. But at the same time, no matter how careful they are, you never know what might happen. He looked at the cup of tea that stood in front of him and added that this is why she must have strength so that she can protect herself. And after a short pause, he added that he did not want to relive what happened 14 years ago. Tutson looked ahead. In his memories, he returned to 14 years ago. That day, Judith, missing for half a day, was found unconscious. It was then that they were told that the baby had inherited the abilities of another demonic clan. She seems to be absorbing magic that touches her body and turning it into her own mana. Then the father could not understand whether it was because of the absorption of mana that Judith was suffering so much. And the healer replied that yes, she absorbs too much mana, which causes a surge in her power. That day, Tutson was sitting next to his father. He was still a teenager, and his face and hands were bandaged. And the father, after the doctor's words, said that this is why Tutson was attacked by Judith. It feels like she perceives everything other than her own mana as an enemy. Although Tuqing was still small, he asked if this meant that someone had attacked her. Since Judith had absorbed a large amount of mana, and the teacher said that this was probably the case. Apparently, it was a spell capable of killing a person. This assumption caused unprecedented anxiety among the Fergra family, and the teacher said that in any case, leaving her in this state is dangerous. He recommended sealing Miss Judith's mana until she was able to control it herself. The worried father asked that if they did this, then there would be no problem with Judith's body. The teacher assured that there would be no problems. In addition, although to a small extent, she will be able to use magic. However, he also warned that the memories of the moment her power surged would also be sealed, so they would not be able to find out who attacked her or why. After this, they decided to seal Judith's mana. And after she came to her senses and found Tutson in the park, she ran up to him and asked if he was in much pain and how he was injured, not remembering anything about the fact that it was she who attacked him. Tukin said that he was too arrogant, so the teacher beat him. He reassured his sister that the bruises and abrasions would heal quickly and she needn't worry. All family members decided to keep the events of that day a secret, and the sweet little girl offered to blow on his wounds so that they would heal faster and not hurt. This choice was made in order to protect Judith. Tutson, remembering all this, said that if the seal was removed, Judith would be able to use stronger magic, but he was not sure that she would be able to cope with it on her own. At that moment, Cain appeared at the door of the dining room and said that he completely agreed with his father. Both the father and the younger brother were glad that he had finally come, since he also had to speak. He was gloomy, and after a short silence, he admitted that Judith was on the verge of death today. If His Majesty had been even a second late, she would have been torn apart by the chimeras. As a result of the investigation, he found out that she took this step to save the daughter of the Marquis Leon, and he concluded that this child cannot sit idly by when others are in danger. There is no guarantee that something like this will never happen again. Tutson thought about his words, and it seemed like they were really compelling arguments. He agreed to remove the seal from her and, going into her room, performed a ritual over the sleeping Judith. He concentrated his powers and cast a spell, and then he touched her forehead with his index finger, concentrating the magic of removing the seal and returning Judith her powers. Father and Cain were nearby and watched everything that was happening. Judith slept until the morning. Her sleep was sound and nothing disturbed it. But when she woke up in the morning and sat up in bed and stretched, she experienced strange sensations. She felt as if she felt a heaviness all over her body due to the fact that she used magic to the limit of her capabilities. She got out of bed and decided to go to the door since it was too noisy there. Judith opened the door of the room and looked outside and asked what happened. Duvushka was surprised, because the emperor stood in front of her. He was so handsome that she fell in love with him while he asked if she slept well. Seeing her puzzled expression, he approached her, and cupping her face with his palms, he asked if she had gotten enough sleep. "Doesn't she have any pain?" Judith smiled sweetly back at him, although she didn't understand why Theo was here. Was she really still sleeping? But behind him, her brothers were also standing, filled with anger, and the elder Cain said displeasedly that how could she have gotten enough sleep if His Majesty had caused such a commotion. But the emperor, turning to them, said that if the two of them had not tried in every possible way to stop him, there would have been no trace of any noise. But Cain's indignation only intensified, and he grumbled that where did they see such an older brother who would allow a stranger to enter the room of his sleeping younger sister? This time Theo smiled and asked what other stranger. This was clearly too much. If he marries Judith, won't they all become his family? But from these words, Judith's brothers seemed to turn black with anger, and she realized that a conflict was brewing. And therefore, grabbing His Majesty by the arm, she said, smiling, that it was not good for him to talk while standing, and suggested that he first go into the room and sit down. And then she turned to the brothers and invited them to go to the dining room first, and as soon as they finished, they would immediately join them. Although the brothers were not delighted, they obeyed. At the same time, Cain said that they should go downstairs as soon as possible, and Tutsin said that if anything happened, Judith should call them. He raised his finger up as if to remind her to kick Theo where he taught her. When they were in her room, Judith thought, seriously. She was outraged that every time he came here, there was such a commotion, and she sharply turned to him and demanded that he not come for her in the future. Theo asked why. After all, he came because he was worried, but she insisted on her own, saying that if he was worried about her, then she would take more nights. And she added that by coming here like this, he was wasting a lot of time. Theo looked at her smiling, while she said that he must be very busy solving government issues. And then she caught herself and asked why he was actually smiling. The emperor, continuing to smile sweetly, said that he simply thought that her face, when she first woke up, was incredibly beautiful. And this answer confused her. She suddenly remembered that she hadn't even washed her face yet, and this discovery made her feel embarrassed, and she covered her face with her hands. But Theo took her hands in his and asked that he said that her face was beautiful, so why did she cover it with her hands? The girl hesitantly replied that she was embarrassed to stand in front of him with an unwashed face. Now Theo looked at her in bewilderment. Judith again sharply turned away from him and said that one way or another she would quickly get ready and go down, and he had better wait for her in the dining room. At that moment, something inexplicable happened. She didn't even understand what exactly. She just swayed and started falling. Theo picked her up, asking if everything was okay. He was alarmed, but the weakness had already passed, and she replied that everything was fine, just a little dizziness. And she added that yesterday she used too much mana, so her stamina is failing her. Theo picked her up, and the girl exclaimed in surprise. He walked away with her in his arms, simultaneously giving the order for the carriage to be prepared. He and Judith are now leaving for the imperial palace, because the imperial doctor must examine her as soon as possible. Judith tried to resist, but it was in vain. When the emperor left Judith's room with her in his arms, all the servants gasped in surprise, and Theo ran along the corridor, trying to get into the carriage as quickly as possible. He ran out into the street, asking as he walked if the carriage was ready, and Judith covered her burning face with her hands, because it seemed to her that she would burn with shame, because she was in only a nightgown. Following them, Duke Fergret and his sons jumped out. He demanded that His Majesty stop, and he asked what he was doing. Theo put her in the carriage, and only then turned to the Duke, and said that Judith said she was dizzy. She seems to be overtired because of what happened yesterday, so he wants to take her to the imperial palace, show her to the court physician, and give her a good rest. The Duke still tried to convince him that Judith would be better off if she stayed in the mansion, but Theo was relentless. He said that he would take responsibility for Judith and take care of her so that everyone could do their work in peace, and he added that for everyone's information, this is an imperial order. After such a statement, Duke Fergra had no choice but to silently watch as the emperor's carriage drove off, taking away his beloved daughter. He and his sons looked gloomily after the retreating carriage. Their faces were frowning, but nothing could be done. This was the order of the emperor. Suddenly, Tuqing screamed, attracting attention, and the duke immediately asked what happened. He scratched the back of his head and said that he forgot to tell Judith that he had unsealed her mana. She may not be ready for this. A few hours later, the emperor's carriage arrived at the palace. After some time, Theodore sat in his office and studied the documents accumulated on his desk. But it worked out poorly for him, since all his thoughts were turned to Judith, and he kept glancing in her direction. She sat at a distance in a chair and read a book. But even from where I was, I noticed that he was endlessly distracted. The girl raised her head and demanded that he stop sneaking glances at her and concentrate on work. Theo tried to object, but she assured him that she was indeed fine, and she added that the doctor said that she was absolutely healthy. He resigned himself to her arguments and again plunged into reading the document, although he was tormented by doubts. Judith, meanwhile, was watching him, and when she saw that he was busy with work, she breathed a sigh of relief. The girl quietly bowed her head and thought that even though she told Theo that she was fine, for some reason she felt such a heaviness throughout her body, and she constantly wanted to sleep. And it was strange. She didn't know what to connect this with, and I remember what happened yesterday and thought that maybe it had become a terrible stress for her. She brought her finger to her eyes, trying to rub them, and thought it was strange why. But her thoughts became confused, her eyelids became heavy, and she instantly dozed off. Theo finally finished reading the next document and put a stamp on it and put it aside. He, too, breathed a sigh of relief that he had finally finished working. He raised his eyes and looked at Judith. I wanted to call her, but the words got stuck in my throat. The girl was sitting on a chair, sleeping peacefully. Theo stood up and walked around the table towards her. He thought that she had fallen asleep while she was waiting for him. He stopped, and looking at his beloved, thought about the fact that lately she had been constantly nodding off, and today her condition was clearly not the same as usual. He remembered that she didn't even touch the food during lunch, saying that she had no appetite. He looked at the sleeping Judith and thought that no serious illness had been found, but her stamina was 0. He continued to think that she was experiencing heaviness throughout her body and had no appetite. What could this be connected with? Suddenly, an unexpected realization struck him. Theo took a closer look at his beloved and thought that she was really pregnant? The girl was sleeping peacefully. Her face was a little paler than usual, but nothing more indicated that she was unwell. Theo remembered the ball and their meeting, the way they looked at each other, how amazed she was by their meeting and how she followed him, and then how they kissed, enveloped in passion, how they spent a magical night together, full of unforgettable sensations. These memories reminded him that he had not taken any precautions that night. He remembered that Judith said that she was taking birth control pills and everything was fine. But what if it suddenly turns out that she is carrying his child under her heart? Just the thought filled his heart with joy. He couldn't even dream about this. Evening was quietly falling on the castle. The sky turned beige and crimson. The sun's last rays illuminated the earth. Judith was carefully carried into the bedroom and laid on the bed to make her more comfortable. But the girl was sleeping so soundly that she didn't even feel it. She opened her eyes and didn't immediately understand where she was. Theo was nearby. He sat at the table next to her bed and continued to work while he waited for her to wake up. And as soon as she moved, he immediately called out to her. The girl sat up in bed, and he picked him up from the table and asked how she was feeling. But Judith was surprised that she was in bed. She wondered who brought her here. She apologized to him for dozing off again, and she added that he just needed to wake her up and not wait for her to wake up. But Theo carefully replied that everything was fine and she could continue to lie there. He sat down on the edge of the bed and mysteriously said that there was no need to overexert himself and suggested that it was better to relax. And he added that during such a period, she should be especially careful. She was at a loss about what period he was talking about, and this time Theo began to ask for forgiveness and said that he should have been more careful and not forced her body to experience the slightest strain. Theo took her hands in his and said that his words were probably confusing her, but he will make every effort to ensure that she does not feel anxious in the future. His words made her smile, but the girl still didn't understand what he was talking about, and so she said with a smile that she didn't understand what he was talking about. Theo became serious and said so that she would not be surprised, and then he said that she was carrying their baby under her heart. Theo paused, and at that moment they heard Tutsun's voice, which was coming somewhere from the corridor. He knocked on the doors and said that he knew that His Majesty was inside. You could hear that he was nervous, and impatience showed in his voice when he said that it had already struck 5 o'clock, so he came for Judith. The Emperor was upset that they were interrupted at such a moment, but still said that he was too noisy and therefore asked to be let in. At the same moment, the doors swung open, and the younger Lord Fergra burst into them with a joyful smile on his face. He immediately went up to his sister and bombarded her with questions about whether everything was okay with her body during the day. Did she suffer from dizziness? Did anything bad happen? Judith was so surprised by his behavior that she hastened to assure him that nothing of the kind had happened. But he still did not let up, and said that at present she should be especially attentive to her body. These words alerted Theo, and after them he was finally convinced that Judith was pregnant. Tutson turned to Theodore and said that he was taking Judith and leaving. Judith thought that they were going to have a fight again, and she felt tired again, although she had only just woken up. But Theo unexpectedly agreed, and only asked to keep a close eye on Judith and bring her home as soon as possible. This surprised the girl so incredibly that she thought it happened to Theo. Theo approached her, took her hands, and looking into her eyes, asked her to rest properly as soon as she returned home. He lowered his eyes and promised her to sort everything out, adding that she should not worry. Judith smiled at him and said goodbye to tomorrow. He and Tutson left, and Theo remained standing looking at the door slamming behind them. He sat down at the table again and exhaled. Theo thought that, as expected, he needed to organize the wedding ceremony as soon as possible. After some time, a sheet of paper with writing lay on the table. This was a special order. When Tutson and Judith left the castle, he again asked how she was feeling. My brother asked that during the day today, did she feel tired or maybe a little nauseous? But Judith replied that except for the fact that she was always sleepy, everything else was fine. Tutson noted that this means how. He stopped and said what he wanted to tell her in the morning. But that damn bastard. His face twisted with disgust when he talked about Theo. He completely unsettled Tutson. But Judith stopped him and asked what he wanted to tell her. Tutson turned away and suggested it would be better to sit down somewhere and he would tell her everything. They walked through the park, and when they were able to sit down, Tutson asked her to give him her hand. Judith was surprised, but still, without asking questions, she extended her hand to her brother. Tukin brought his palm to hers, and a blue glow formed between their hands. Her brother warned her that she would now feel slightly unwell. And indeed, after a couple of seconds, Judith felt unpleasant, and she closed one eye, trying to endure this unpleasant feeling. The girl thought that her stomach was twisting so much, as if she was going to vomit. She was wondering what it was. After some time, the blue glow stopped, and Tutson happily said that everything was fine and he was finished. He looked at her guiltily and asked her to forgive him for making her feel uncomfortable. However, Tuking explained that he cast a healing spell and then promised that her condition would soon improve. Judith tried to raise and lower her hand, and noted that, indeed, not a trace remained of the former heaviness in the body. But she asked what his words about the healing spell meant. Does she have some kind of illness? Tutson hesitated, not knowing where to start. He was silent for a while, and then said that she probably knows that her ability is to nullify magic, but he tried to find the words. In reality, her ability is to absorb magic touching her body and turn it into her own mana. He continued by saying that the more she is attacked, the stronger she becomes, but at the same time it is a dangerous ability that can cause a surge of magical power, so they had to seal her talent until recently. However, since she was already quite an adult, he felt that she could fully take responsibility for this power, so he removed the seal last night. Judith looked at him with wide eyes, and it was precisely because of this that she felt unwell throughout the day today. Tuching explained that the flow of mana had become unstable and was affecting her body. Judith, I was ready to explode from so much information. She didn't really understand what he was talking about. This didn't happen in the original novel. And what kind of seal are we talking about? The girl concentrated, and looking at Tutson, said that it was not that she doubted his words. But is it really possible that she was completely unaware of something so significant? Tutson looked down. To some extent, he felt guilty towards her. But he still said that, to be honest, along with the mana, they also sealed her memories of that day. And that's why she still can't remember anything about what happened when she went missing at the age of 6. Judith thought about it. She tried to compare at least some memories, And now she realized that it seems that it was at that age that she first met Theo. She was so interested to know what happened then. And it seemed that since that day, the original plot had changed a lot, but she didn't have any information. Tutsin, seeing her confusion, stood up and said that now it was time for them to return home, since it was already late and her father was probably going crazy. But at that moment they called out to him, and Tutsin turned around and saw a servant quickly approaching them. The man said that it was lucky that he was still in the castle. An emergency notification came from the magic tower. He needed to go there urgently. But Tuqing said that he had to take Judith home, so he asked them to wait for him. Judith intervened in their conversation, and assuring her brother that everything was fine with her, she told him to hurry up. And although Tuqing objected, she said that now she had more bodyguards than before, and she would immediately go home, so he didn't have to worry. Tutsin agreed, but already halfway there he turned around and said that she should under any circumstances, turn away from the path. And he sternly asked if she was clear. She sat in the carriage and looked out the window at people passing by and at the landscapes. She had a lot to think about. But when they reached the square, they wondered why there were so many people here. Is there really some kind of fair today? She wanted to see what was happening there, but she gave her word to Tutsin and must control herself. But then another thought came to her. She would like to look into the Camilla bakery at least once. She suddenly remembered her friend in the black cloak and thought that she had not seen him since they separated that evening when he saved her. She had the idea that what if he thought that she had simply deceived him by not giving him the due reward? And then her gaze caught a tall figure with dark hair from the crowd. The man's shoulders were covered with a dark cape with a hood. Judith wondered if it was him. She couldn't miss such a chance, so she ordered the carriage to stop immediately. She jumped out of the carriage with such speed that the guards could not keep up with her. And Judith only thought that if she didn't hurry up now, she would lose sight of him. She told the guards that she would return quickly and ordered them to wait for her here. The guard jumped out of the carriage and shouted that leaving alone was very dangerous. He peered into the crowd, trying to spot his mistress among the people, but in vain. Judith seemed to have disappeared. The young guard became scared. She ran in the crowd and shouted to that person to wait for her. She didn't know his name, so she couldn't even call him normally. So she pressed up a little and reached out to grab his cape. Judith was out of breath and couldn't keep up with him for long. So she grabbed the hood and ordered him to stand. Finally, I could catch my breath. She wondered why his step was so fast. At that moment, the man turned and asked her what happened. He was completely different from her friend. It was a different person. Judith was confused at first, and then she felt uneasy. It was necessary to recognize it that way. She ran as fast as she could, afraid of losing sight of him, but it turned out it wasn't him. She began to politely apologize for confusing him with another person. And now he seemed completely different from the other one, as she had thought at first. The man turned and walked on, and Judith looked after him, thinking that the empire was so huge that she could not accidentally collide with him like that. And only now did she realize that she was standing in the middle of the street completely alone. Judith thought that if Tutsin found out, he would start grumbling again. And so before the guards started to worry, he should have gone back. At that moment, a passing man pushed her, and she screamed in surprise. And he asked her not to stand rooted to the spot in the middle of the street. Judith asked her to forgive her, but at that moment, someone else grabbed this passing man by the hand and commanded him to stop. But the hooligan started screaming to be released quickly. A scandal began. A voice familiar to her said that this bully seemed to have something to return to the lady. Judith looked in their direction and was stunned. It was him, her black-haired friend. As before, he was wearing a black cape, and a hood covered his head, and dark strands of hair fell over his face. Judith asked him why he was here, and the stranger also looked in her direction. He was silent, and only the bully continued to dodge and demand that they let him go and take their hands off him. But the stranger only twisted him more tightly, put his hand behind his back, until he could no longer resist and only howled in pain. And iard said that on such a crowded street, if a noble lady in an expensive dress walks alone, unaccompanied, then she becomes an ideal target for petty thieves. At that moment, something fell out and clanged on the stones of the pavement. Judith exclaimed in surprise that it was her bracelet. The girl touched the place on her arm where it hung and did not find it there. Was she surprised when they managed to steal it? Iard at this moment continued his execution, saying that the thief dared to touch the belongings of a representative of the nobility without a bit of fear. He asked if he knew what punishment awaited him for theft in the empire. The bully turned and looked at his tormentor out of the corner of his eye. This was a serious accusation, and he was seriously frightened and seemed no longer so greyhound. Suddenly, Judith intervened and said that she was the injured party in this incident, and she added that it would be more correct for her to decide on his punishment. And then she asked, "Isn't it?" Ichard looked at her not without surprise. He was silent for a while, and then said whatever she wished. Judith asked him to let go of his hand, and approaching the thief, said that stealing was a bad thing. She asked if he knew that even captured children receive punishment. But the guy was silent. He lowered his head and said guiltily that he knew, but added that he still needed money. Judith asked why he needed them, and the boy said that his younger sister is sick, so he needs money for medicine, but he is not able to find that much money right now. Judith believed him and said that then she would pay for the medicine instead of him. The guy asked in disbelief that this is true. Ichard stood aside and watched all this with a disapproving look. Judith replied that yes, but in return he must promise that he will never steal again. A new expression appeared in Ichard's eyes. It was something mixed, a feeling of pride and respect for her kindness. The guy took the money and walked away, thanking the girl for her kindness. He said he will never forget the help provided. Judith shouted after him to take good care of his little sister, and in no case did he forget about his promise. She heard a voice behind her. It was Ichard who caught her attention. He said he wondered what she was going to do by asking him to cede decision-making power over his punishment. He approached her and asked if she really believed that the words he said were true. It is clear that this is a preconceived lie, just for such a case. Judith responded by asking if he was worried that she might have been deceived, and she ironically said that he turns out to be caring and knows how to be caring. Ichard remained silent. Judith looked after the boy and said that he was right. She can't know for sure whether he lied or not, but it didn't matter to her. Ichard looked at her inquisitively, and she continued that even if he lied, she would be calm that there was no sick child. And since he has her money today, at least today, he will not touch other people's things. She asked if Ichard had noticed that child's clothes. It was very worn, so most likely the words that he has a hard life are true. Of course, theft is bad, but... Judith paused and then continued, saying that she believes that the adults who created this unjust world are also responsible for such acts. Ichard remained silent as she continued, adding that it might seem hypocritical of her, but it was all she could do right now. A new spark lit up in his eyes. He looked at Judith, and that spark was connected to her. He was imbued with her kindness and spiritual purity, and Judith said that to be honest, she wants to believe that that child told the truth. She smiled with such a radiant and sincerely happy smile that it seemed that flowers bloomed around her from her warmth. He opened his mouth wanting to tell her something, but at that moment the guard's voice reached them. He finally found his mistress. Judith turned to his call, and Ichard froze in place. The girl saw a security guard waving his hand at her from the opposite side of the street. He made his way through the crowd towards them, and as he walked, made the remark that she was in such a place and alone, and he literally demanded that they go back. Judith realized that she had completely forgotten about the bodyguard. She thought she was now in serious trouble. Finally, out of breath, he approached her and said that how could she just up and leave? If only she knew how long he had been looking for her. Judith asked for forgiveness and admitted that she saw a familiar face and decided to hurry. This admission surprised the guard. He asked what friend she was talking about, who she was with. Judith looked around at this time, but there was no one nearby. She started saying that this person had helped her a lot earlier, and then she fell silent mid-sentence. The alley where he and Ichard stood was empty, and the girl couldn't believe her eyes. He was just here, and he disappeared again before she could thank him for his help. She thought with hope that they would be able to see him again. Ichard, meanwhile, tried to leave this place unnoticed, and therefore made his way carefully looking around. He saw a guard approach Judith, and thought that there were more guards, and now it would be more difficult to approach the Duke's daughter. He again came to an alley that consisted of animal cages, and then they met his man again. He said that, as Ichard had instructed, preparations for the test to duplicate the abilities of the Duke's daughter had been completed. She added that all that remains is to get her blood, but they don't yet know how to do it. Ichard replied that for now he was the only one who knew her personally, so she would act less wary when she saw him. Then the woman said that in this case they were completely counting on him. Dragon's ability to clone from the Emperor has side effects, and to gain full power, The strength of the ducal daughter is needed. Ichard watched her hiding behind the wall of one of the buildings and thought about why he was helping her and not taking what he needed. He remembered how he wanted to punish her offender who dared to brazenly steal her jewelry. Ichard thought about it. Really, why did he want to keep her out of trouble, to protect her? Some kind of pleasant, warm feeling filled his chest. Suddenly he began to choke. There was not enough air. He bent over, trying to take a breath. Why did the attack happen at such a moment? It was as if he felt hands reaching out to him, wanting to grab him by the neck. He remembered those hands, but the last thing he wanted was their embrace. From the darkest depths, he heard a voice, the voice that called him. It was she, his mother, a beautiful woman with the same jet black hair and the same black soul. She stood behind him and wrapped her arms around him. With one hand, she grabbed his chin, and he heard her voice saying that she had said that no one could love such an imperfect body. He heard her voice right next to his ear, as if she had leaned down and whispered to him, so that every word would be imprinted like a brand on his soul, plunging it into blackness. She said the same goes for that woman, Judith. Although she treats him kindly, but Ichard imagined the image of Judith and her face with a frozen grimace of contempt. It was as if glass had cracked, streaking her image into pieces, and her mother's voice continued to ask whether she would behave the same way when she found out who he really was. The voice told him to listen to his mother, because she is the only one who thinks about him. Ichard experienced physical pain from imagining that Judith would despise him. He cupped his face and groaned. The attack gradually passed, and it became easier for him to breathe. He sat on his knees on the ground, holding his heart with one hand. Ichard said that the ghost with senile dementia is too talkative. The cycle of attacks becomes shorter. As expected, he should obtain the ability of the Duke's daughter, and to do this, he will have to wound her in order to get her blood. Ichard looked ahead with detachment. It was as if he saw nothing, his gaze expressed nothing. He breathed out 2 words about how tired he was. This was the northern part of the Waldemar Empire, the castle of the Marchioness Spencer. A golden-haired girl sat in a bathtub filled with water and strewn with rose petals, and her maid stood nearby, ready at any moment for her mistress's orders. At that moment, another maid entered and said that Mr. Lloyd was requesting an audience. She added that he said that there was an urgent message for her from the imperial palace, and the girl asked what the Marquise would order to do. The Marquise, without leaving the bathroom, ordered him to be let in. She was separated by a screen, and when Lloyd entered, he stopped in front of the screen and said that he asked to forgive him for appearing in the middle of the night. But she stopped him and asked him to do without greetings. She was told that he had an urgent message for her from the imperial palace. The maid continued to rub her body, and the man said from behind the screen that the emperor himself had sent him to the Marquise. Therefore, Lloyd tried to deliver the message as quickly as possible. Then the Marquise said that if so, then let him read it. And the man immediately fulfilled her wish. This was a request for a representative of the Spencer estate. The emperor wrote to her that spring had not yet come in the north, but he needed a couple of cherry trees in bloom for his wedding ceremony. And if there are trees that have not yet bloomed, then the Marquise should have sent them right away. The Marquise noted with surprise that this was for a wedding. And this boy too. She asked that preparations for the wedding ceremony had really begun a long time ago, but the messenger replied that this was not so, and as far as he knew, the emperor was not interested in women, and it was difficult for his closest associates to even mention a wedding. But he did not finish, because the splash of water was heard, and the Marquise came out of the bathroom. She said that because of the sudden appearance of his lover, he began to hastily prepare for the wedding ceremony and even sent her such an absurd request. The maid threw a robe over her shoulders, and Marquise Spencer said, turning to Lloyd, that he had an hour to choose trees, and he could take no more than 10 pieces. The Marquise smiled mysteriously and said that she needed to see with her own eyes what kind of woman had fallen into the heart of this boy emperor. There was talk in the imperial palace that Marquise Spencer was going to hold a banquet in the capital. The emperor answered in the affirmative, but was dissatisfied, and said that he did not know what she was up to, but only girls were invited. And he also added that Judith should also receive an invitation, but she might not even open it, just refuse. Judith looked at him and was silent without answering. Her face looked thoughtful. Elsette Spencer, the current Marchioness Spencer, and Theo's only maternal cousin. The Marquis Spencer's family fell, accused of helping Theo's mother and participating in the poisoning of Ichard. And all members of the family, with the exception of Elsette, who was 10 years old at that time, and her newborn nephew were executed. And even though everyone now thought that the Spencer family was finished, Elsette thought differently. Having joined the Knights, she and Theo went through all sorts of battles, earning great glory. Thanks to this, she became a close ally of the Emperor, gaining a position that no one could surpass within the Empire. This character was respected by Serna, the main character of the original novel. Besides, Elseth considered the villainous Judith to be an eyesore, and this could not help but upset Judith. Judith wondered why she invited her to the banquet. She probably wants to find out if she is the same girl who is dating her brother. She must have heard rumors that she and Theo were dating and decided to check out what kind of fruit Judith was. All this time, Theo carefully watched his beloved and, seeing her confusion, said that if it was difficult for her to refuse, then he could do it instead. He added that her health is more important now, but Judith replied that the Marquise herself was inviting her. She thought that, besides, Elseth seemed to be Theo's closest ally. Even if you avoid meeting now, they will certainly collide in the future. She also asked him that recently he continued to worry about her health. The girl asked if Tu-King told her anything about this, and she added that if this is the case, then she is already completely fine. But Theo replied that it was okay, because she still had to go through huge trials for 9 more months, so she shouldn't overexert herself. Judith was surprised and confused by his words about 9 months, and so she directly asked what he was exactly saying now about the seal that was placed on her Maena, and he repeated after her with bewilderment. And then he asked what she was talking about, because he meant their child, whom she now carried under her heart. At his words, Judith's eyes widened beyond belief. Child? What is he talking about? She couldn't even imagine that Theo would misunderstand the situation, and she kept wondering why he had been acting so suspiciously for several days now. Either she worries that her clothes are very thin and she might freeze, then she offers books on caring for children, then she plays classical music. And on top of everything else, he kept asking embarrassing questions. He looked at her questioningly, but Judith wondered what kind of child. She had no idea how Theo would behave when Serna appeared on the horizon. Now these conversations seemed to her something far from reality. In the evening, when she returned to her father's palace, they brought her an envelope. The servant brought it and said that while she was in the imperial palace, an invitation was brought to her from the Marchioness Spencer. Judith took the envelope, and thinking that what was supposed to come had arrived, she began to unwrap it, feeling a slight excitement. Tudson came up so unexpectedly and asked that this was an invitation to a banquet hosted by the Spencer family that Judith was a little scared. And he, not seeing her confusion, asked whether it would be better to refuse. Tudson said thoughtfully that Marquise Spencer has a very strained relationship with her brother Cain. This surprised Judith even more, and she asked that Cain knew the Marchioness. Tudson said that to say that he was just an acquaintance would be an understatement, and he blurted out that these two dated about 10 years ago. This news came as a real shock to Judith. She said that this was such an old story, but she knew nothing about it. But Tudson again stunned her that their relationship did not last even a week. And then he added that somehow he just jokingly teased him, and he took it and broke up with the Marchioness Spencer the very next day. He remembered the moment when he said in front of Judith that Cain was now very busy, hinting at his relationship with Elseth, and now she can only play with Tucson. Judith looked at him reproachfully, but Tudson asked not to glare at him like that, and, in his defense, said that he also didn't know that his brother would pull such a trick. He added that in any case, after that, as soon as she sees her brother, a piercing wind immediately begins to blow. And he suggested that who knows, maybe she will decide to take out her anger on her and asked her to be careful. After this conversation, Judith became even more anxious, because no matter how you look at it, she is the reason for the breakup. Was this setup intentional because Judith is a villain? She had already almost died during the incident with Isabella. Was she really going to have to go through something like that again? But after this thought came another, and now, when she thought about it, she became terribly angry. She didn't personally offend Elseth in any way, did she? It wasn't her fault that she ended up in Judith's body. Not that Theo and Cain are distinguished by some kind of originality. Can a situation be called fair when she is hated only because, according to the original plan, she is a villain? A few days later, the appointed banquet took place. It took place at the residence of the Marchioness Spencer. Judith, as expected, was a little worried about going to the banquet without her brothers, and was a little indecisive, because this time her every action would result in judging the Pilgrim family. Although she could hide her face, like during a masquerade ball, but she ordered herself to pull herself together and not dare to be a coward. She straightened her shoulders and with a proud posture prepared to appear before the marquise. The butler announced that Lady Judith from the Duke's Pilgrim family had arrived. She entered the doors that opened before her and thought that after all, she was a loser who had lived in this world for 20 years as a duke's daughter. Marquise Elzit was among the guests, many of whom had already gathered in the banquet hall. When Judith entered the hall, all attention turned to her. She duly approached the marquise and greeted her with a slight bow, saying that it was a great honor for her to meet the marquise. And then she thanked me for the honor of being invited to this event. Elzit said thoughtfully that this was a banquet to which partners were not allowed, so she thought that Judith would not come. She looked at Judith and extended her hand, thanking her for responding to the invitation. Elzit looked with an inquisitive gaze, but there was no arrogance in it. Judith smiled back. She knew little about Elzita because almost nothing was said about her in the original, and now that Judith saw her in person, she dazzled with her magnificence. Moreover, we were talking about a girl who doesn't even wear a dress to a banquet, so Judith especially didn't want to be hated by her. The marquise noticed Judith's inquisitive gaze and asked why she was looking at her so intently. "Are you surprised that Elzit didn't wear a dress?" But Judith assured her that this was not the reason, and said that the marquise's outfit suited her very well and she looked great. Elzit looked at her and was silent. Her gaze became thoughtful, and Judith got nervous that she was thinking about something completely different and accidentally misspoke. But at that moment Elzit smiled and asked, pointing behind Judith, what kind of box was in the hands of the maid standing behind her. Judith turned and looked in the direction indicated. The maid was holding a pink box tied with a scarlet ribbon. Judith completely forgot about her out of nerves, and now she said that this was her small gift for my lady. Judith said that she heard the marquise loves sweets, so she prepared it especially for her, but she doesn't know if she will like such a gift. The box was opened, and there were several types of cookies. It looked very tasty. Marquise Elzit said it was so cute. She added that she saw that Judith had prepared these cookies with all her sincerity, and again, her gaze became wary, and she suddenly asked why Judith was giving her these cookies. Judith's eyes widened, and she began to panic again. She couldn't figure out if she had chosen the wrong gift. Elzit seemed to be looking at her so sternly, it seemed that her anger could not be avoided. The girls looked at each other without taking their eyes off. Judith was bitter about the situation. She lowered her eyes sadly and didn't know what to say. She thought that it would be nice to make a good impression at the first meeting. But it turns out that changing attitudes towards Judith is not so easy. Judith nervously wriggled her fingers and, not knowing what else to say, said that she just wanted to get along with the marquise. The marquise choked with laughter, and Judith became even more wary that she would now be ridiculed and disgraced in front of everyone, as Tutsin had expected. She felt uneasy. But the marquise smiled and asked to forgive her, adding that Judith should not be so afraid of her. She walked up to the girl and took her by the chin and forced her to look at her. Elzit said that she heard Theo was crazy about some lady, so she decided to see what kind of insidious fox she was and ended up encountering a cute rabbit. She was so good-natured that Judith smiled too. Ultimately, Elzit apologized for her rude behavior and said that she had not invited her to the banquet in order to torture her. She just wanted to see what kind of person Theo fell in love with him. She also said that although there was no need to show any anger, Judith was so nervous that Elzit unconsciously wanted to tease her. Judith relaxed a little and smiled again. The marquise also asked why Judith was so nervous. Does the marquise really have such a scary image? But Judith replied that her words might be a little presumptuous, but she was nervous because the marchioness had a very strained relationship with her brother Cain. Elzit became sad. It was true, of course, that she hated that fool Cain, but she said that what her brother did and her attitude towards Judith were two different things. She also added that she doesn't treat others unfairly because of something like this. And then something happened that Judith did not expect at all. Elzit took her hand and kissed it, saying that their conversation had gone a little long, and the fact that her crazy brothers are not here today, so Judith can enjoy the banquet to her heart's content. After that, the marquise turned around and went to the other guests, leaving Judith alone with herself. The girl looked after Elzit with admiration and thought that she was truly an amazing person. She couldn't believe whether Brother Cain was in his right mind, and how could he reject such a girl? At that moment, from the side, she heard someone say that they had a chance to meet again. Judith turned and saw the girl in front of her. It was Renee. She remembered that they had seen each other at hunting competitions. Judith politely said that she was glad to see her again. Renee said that this was their first meeting after the hunting competition, and she asked if she had already seen Miss Isabella. And then she added that it seemed she had recently been looking for Judith. Judith smilingly said that she had not seen her yet, but thought to herself that she didn't really want to see Isabella, and why was she looking for her? Then other ladies came up to them. They greeted each other and also expressed a desire to greet Lady Pilgrim. There were 3 of them. The young girl introduced herself first, saying that her name was Sienna. She was the eldest daughter of Count Gorton, and next to her is her mother. Judith said that she was glad to meet Countess Gorton. The Countess said that when she learned that Judith would attend the banquet, she wanted to greet her without fail. Judith at this time noticed a girl standing behind the backs of these 2 women. It was strange why they didn't introduce the girl who was standing behind them. She took a closer look at it. She seemed to have a sad look. The girl noticed that they were looking at her, and it seemed to surprise her. Her lips curled slightly into a smile, and she nodded her head in greeting. Judith thought that she must have a shy disposition, or what. But this situation haunted her. The girls sat down in the living room, and small talk began between them. Sienna asked if they heard that the Marquise organized a banquet to find a daughter-in-law for Spencer's house. Another girl said that she heard the Marquise say that she would pass on the title of Marquis to her only nephew. Another one of them said that if she succeeded here, she could become a Marquise. Everyone smiled, but Judith thought that she was tired. It seemed that her head was starting to buzz. She wondered what it would be like to host a banquet where only women gathered, but all they talked about was marriage. Judith heard someone address her and returned to reality. Renee was surprised that she hadn't said a word recently, and she suggested that maybe Judith wasn't feeling well. Judith did not miss this opportunity and said that she had not been to banquets for a long time, so she felt a little tired. She apologized and asked if she could leave them first. Nobody objected. Therefore, Judith, quietly rejoicing at her luck, hurried to leave them and left the castle. It was a starry night outside. She thought that she should quickly return home and lie down in her bed, but at the opposite end of the entrance, a girl was sitting alone on a bench under the fountain. She took a closer look. Wasn't this the youngest daughter of Earl Gorton, who stood behind her mother and older sister? Judith wondered why she was alone. She looked around. Here and there, groups of other noblewomen stood and had cheerful conversations. Her mother and sister stood not far away and were also chatting animatedly, not really caring that their youngest daughter and sister were left alone. Everything became clear to Judith. This girl was an outcast in her own family. Judith remembered herself in a past life. She also experienced similar feelings and was uninteresting and unnecessary to anyone. Judith approached the girl and asked if she would mind if she sat next to her. The girl pronounced her name in surprise, as if not believing that Lady Pilgrim wanted to sit down next to her. Judith looked at her and smiled friendly. Therefore, the younger Miss Gorton immediately invited her to sit down, and Judith gratefully accepted her offer. Judith said that, come to think of it, she still doesn't know her name, and she asked if she could ask what her name was. The girl introduced herself by saying that her name was Leona. She said that she was pleased to meet Miss Leona, and added that since she saw her, she wanted to talk to her. The young countess responded by saying that she also wanted to share the conversation with her, but before they had time to exchange greetings, they were immediately interrupted. As if out of nowhere, a girl appeared and stated that she had been looking everywhere for Judith, and she ended up here. It was Isabella. She smiled welcomingly and had a basket in her hands. She unceremoniously asked why they were here, and again said that she had been looking for her everywhere. Leona was clearly upset by Isabella's appearance. She thought that now Miss Judith would be taken away, and she would be left alone again. Isabella actually frowned and asked who was sitting next to her, but Judith was not going to go anywhere. On the contrary, she said that Isabella should meet Miss Leona from the family of Earl Gorton. Leona, in turn, said hello, and added that it seemed they had already met at another banquet, and asked if she remembered her. But Isabella arrogantly shook her head, answering that she was not sure, although it seemed they had met. Judith, watching her, thought that Isabella did not have good feelings towards her, but why was she so harsh with Leona? But Isabella turned to Judith again and said that what was more important was, did she know what she had in her bag? There were all kinds of chocolates. Judith guessed it was chocolate. Isabella's eyes sparkled, and she said that these were not just chocolate, but chocolates with whiskey. They are called whiskey bonbon. She didn't bring them personally for Judith, but she offered to treat her to a couple if Judith didn't mind. After all, she remained in Judith's debt last time. Judith thanked her for her kindness and asked if she would mind if Miss Leona tried it too. Isabella absolutely did not want to treat anyone else with sweets, but the rules of decency did not allow her to refuse, although she was ready to throw lightning bolts out of anger. Meanwhile, Elsette sat at the table and looked at the cookies that Judith gave her. She said incredulously, "What do you mean these cookies were made by Miss Judith herself?" The maid approached her and said that His Majesty Emperor Theodore had arrived. He waited in the guest room, and the servants waited for orders on what to do. But Elsette decided to go to him herself. He sat on one of the chairs with his arms crossed over his chest and looked with a dissatisfied look. Elsette sat down opposite him, and taking a bite of the cookie, said that it seems she didn't invite him to the banquet. Theodore became wary and asked what she was eating there, and then he clarified that these are cookies. Elsette replied that he had a diamond eye, and showing him the cookies she asked, "Isn't it cute?" Although one ear was no longer there, but Theo replied that not really. Elsette expressed surprise and said that Judith baked it, and Theo was struck by an electric shock. He immediately approached the marquise and unceremoniously snatched the cookies from her hands. The girl was puzzled by this behavior, and Theo looked at her sternly and said that he meant that he didn't really like the way she was holding him in her hands. It was as if he was angry, and Elsette saw through his emotions. Theo irritably asked why Judith gave her the cookies, and the marquise teasingly replied that she said she wanted to get along with her. Theo thought it was a cookie that he still couldn't get. He no longer wanted to communicate with the marquise. He asked where Judith is now. The girls, meanwhile, sat in a gazebo in the night garden. They ate chocolate that Isabella brought and drank wine, meanwhile talking about this and that until the conversation touched on justice. Isabella said that she is the daughter of the Marquis of Lyon, but her father only communicates with her younger brother as if he were his own child. He doesn't care about her opinion. The girl drooped and said that he believed that the main thing was to marry her off successfully. But she has no intention of walking down the aisle at all. Leona, in turn, said that her family doesn't even care about this. Making the right connections and getting a marriage proposal, all this is her older sister's share. Although she wasn't interested in marriage either, it was a little sad that her mother only cared about her older sister. Isabella looked at her knowingly, and Leona continued to say that it felt like she believed that her youngest daughter had no value. At this moment, Judith was indignant that who even dared to say such a thing. She demanded that this man be brought here and she would scold him. Isabella was touched by her determination, and Miss Leona was worried that Judith was all right and said that she seemed to have eaten too much candy. The girls' eyes widened. They were clearly surprised by something, but Judith did not notice it. She replied that she was perfectly fine, and she did not react in any way to Leona's warning to be careful. Judith was clearly intoxicated and continued to demand that she be told who needed to be scolded, not noticing that the emperor was standing behind her. The girls jumped out of their seats, and only then did Judith realize that something was wrong. The emperor approached her and, taking her hand, asked where she was going to go. And Judith was so surprised by his appearance that she didn't immediately find what to say. But when she saw him, she was happy. The girl's cheeks were rosy from alcohol, and the eyes sparkled especially brightly. She asked if he came because he missed her, and she immediately threw herself into his arms. Such behavior was so unusual for Judith that the emperor was extremely surprised. He said that it was true, because she did not come to the imperial palace today. He held her by the waist because Judith was unsteady on her feet. She laid her head on his chest and thought, why was she so drunk? It seemed to her that she only took a couple of sips of wine. Could it be that the reason lay in the sweets that Isabella brought? But she immediately pulled away from Theo and said that time was running out. She needed to go quickly. She invited him to come with her, but he still didn't understand where. And when she said that she was telling off the bad guys, Theo was completely confused. He looked at her with an uncomprehending look. At this time, the marquise was heading towards them. Theo, so that no one would see Judith in this state, said that Judith needed to rest, so he asked to borrow one of the guest rooms. The marquise condescendingly replied that they could be located in any location. But Theo told her that she was being too disrespectful. Theo took his beloved in his arms and thought that what a blessing that only women were invited to the banquet. He looked at her pretty face and thought that if other men saw this appearance, he might have to gouge out their eyes. They settled down in one of the guest rooms. He sat Judith on a chair and sat down next to her. Theo held her hands and asked how she was feeling. The girl replied that her throat was dry, and he immediately went to bring her something to drink. But she took him by the edge of his sleeve and asked him not to leave. Theo said that she herself said that she was thirsty. Judith was silent. He asked why should he stay with her, but Judith looked at him in a special way and said meaningfully that he should not stand there. Theo sat down next to her, and she sat in his arms and asked him to stay with her like this. Theo looked at her with piercing eyes, and she looked at him. He said that he didn't think it was right in the current situation, but Judith could not be stopped. Alcohol removed all barriers, and she, looking at him, asked that if he is handsome, does he think that's all? From her lips it sounded brutal. Theo, not understanding her, asked again, and she explained to him that she meant that he sat and seduced her without any effort. She put her hands on his chest, where he could feel his toned muscles under his shirt. Then she ran her finger over her lips and said that these insidious lips, and with the words that she should scold him well, she threw her arms around his neck and kissed him on the lips. Theo was taken aback by such an act, but Judith deviated from him. She seemed to have fainted or fallen asleep. He picked up her head and called her name, but she didn't react. There were a lot of questions running through Theo's head, but she couldn't answer them. He looked at the girl and quietly asked if she was sleeping, and Judith sat on his lap and did not answer. And then she leaned her head on his chest and fidgeted, making herself more comfortable. The movement made Theo think he was going crazy. His heart jumped out of his chest from the proximity of his beloved, and an ocean of tenderness filled his soul. Morning has come, and Judith extended her hand and placed it on her head and said that it was splitting. It was hard for her to even open her eyes. It seemed that this movement would hurt even more. The maid, noticing that her mistress had woken up, hurried to her aid. She asked if her mistress was okay, but Judith, trying to sit up, said that she was not at all okay. She opened one eye and, noticing that she was in her room, asked Marie how she returned home yesterday. She remembered that yesterday she ate whiskey sweets with Isabella. Marie looked at her mistress with a sympathetic look and said that His Majesty had personally brought her to the residence. Because of this, the Duke and the young gentleman were in terrible indignation, and when she said that to say that there was terrible turmoil would be an understatement. Judith felt as if she had been shocked. She remembered. I remembered last night how she seduced Theo, how she kissed him on the lips, and I also remembered the look on Theo's face. Judith felt ashamed because she suggested keeping her distance, saying that she had to prepare herself mentally, and she attacked him herself. Judith felt even worse. She wanted to fall into the ground from shame. She could only imagine how discouraged he was. She cried out that she would not go to the imperial palace today. Marie was taken aback by her scream, but Judith kept saying that she wouldn't go, period. She seemed to be hysterical. She actually stayed at home and decided to spend the day in bed. She was reading a book, but her thoughts were that she didn't go to the imperial palace, and now she had to suffer from boredom. But suddenly Marie burst into her room and said that they were in trouble. Judith looked up from the book and her thoughts and asked in fear what had happened. And Marie said that His Majesty the Emperor had personally come to see her. The girl couldn't believe it. But the very next second, the butler knocked on the door of her room, notifying her of what Marie had just said. Marie curtsied and said that such a modest insect greeted the never-fading sun of the empire. But Theo didn't even look at her. He was only interested in Judith. He just asked if she was sleeping. The maid turned towards the bed on which her mistress lay and hesitated. Judith wrapped her head in the sheet, and now a lump had formed in its place. She curled up and lay there without making a sound. Theo's face lit up with a sweet smile. He was amazed by the behavior of his beloved, who just yesterday had kissed him so shamelessly, and now, like a child, was hiding in the sheets. Judith lay in her cocoon and wondered if the emperor had left. But he sat down on the edge of the bed and asked how she was feeling. And all the girl's hopes were dashed. "He's here!" She replied that she was fine and heard his response that he was glad to hear it. And the next moment she was in his arms, wrapped in sheets and face to face with Theo. He said that he had come all this way, but she wouldn't even show him her face? Judith demanded that he let her go. She was ashamed to look into his eyes, and therefore she did not look into them. But Theo, smiling, objected that yesterday she was the first to sit on his lap, but today she doesn't want to? He seemed to be in great spirits. Judith said that yesterday she committed a crime against him that was worthy of death, and he became serious. Theo thought how cute she was, and he asked what crime exactly. The girl felt completely uneasy, and said that she got drunk and behaved inappropriately in front of him. She called him by name in front of everyone and spoke too tactlessly. She also thought that she had groped him and even managed to kiss him. In her defense, she could only say that in the future she would not get drunk, and the emperor said that this was a good idea. He also said that if she appeared like this in front of other men, it would create some difficulties for him too. Judith thought there wasn't even a bit of laughter in his eyes. He ran his finger over her face and said that it seemed she hadn't scolded him properly. The girl looked at him with wide eyes. It seemed to her that the whole world had disappeared, and only they remained. But the shameful memories of last night again surfaced in her memory, and tears appeared in her eyes. Theo looked at her with incomprehension, not understanding the reason for her tears, and she asked him not to make fun of her. That evening the emperor was sitting at table in his palace. There was paper and pen in front of him. He thought sadly that today he would no longer see Judith. Marquise Elzet entered the office and said that since he had put aside his business and went to the ducal residence, why doesn't he stop frowning? She said reproachfully. That thanks to His Majesty, who called her, and then suddenly disappeared, she smiled all the time while walking around the imperial palace. He said that she had arrived. The marquise replied that yes and asked for what reason he called her, and since he made her wait like that, it means it's important. Theo looked at her seriously and said that she needed to find someone. He asked her to conduct an investigation into the Tempest Guild as quietly as possible and to do it together with Kane. But his request caused a flurry of negativity from Elzet. She slammed her hands on the table. Her face was distorted by a grimace of displeasure, and she muttered, "Why on earth? She should cooperate with this person? And how important is the bird to find?" Theo was still serious. He paused and said that iard had shown up. Elzeth was even more shocked by this statement. She screamed, "How did that happen?" According to Kane's report, it was confirmed that he came to the Valdemar Empire through Eliast 2 months ago. Traces of chimeras were found at each base, which proves his experiments related to black magic. Elseth said that it looks like he is still aiming for Theo's place. She said that she told him that if he left him alive, it would turn out to be a disaster. Theo stood up from his seat and said that if he began to act personally, then any smart person would guess that iard was alive. That's why he entrusts the search to the two of them, so that it is in no way conspicuous. Theo turned to the window, and the marquise asked that he was worried that the rebels would go over to Icard's side. But she immediately said that such a force could hardly have any influence on Theo. Theo became sullen, but confirmed that the rebels posed no threat to him. Knowing this, they will try to put pressure on him in other ways. Elset also stood up. She asked what he meant by other means. She hesitated and thought for a few seconds, and then asked that he really thought the rebels would attack Judith. Theo turned to her and looked straight at her. His look was more eloquent than words. He clenched his fists thinking about this possibility. Elzet, meanwhile, said that when she saw the mention of marriage in the letter, she thought it was some kind of joke. She looked at the emperor and questioned whether he was really serious about Lady Pilgrim. Theo was silent. He changed the subject by saying that, like she said, Icard must be targeting his place. Valdemar is an empire united by conquering neighboring countries. Therefore, there are still many who harbor resentment in their souls, and Icard can use this for his own purposes. Therefore, risk factors that could become a source of rebellion must be eliminated in advance. After listening to his arguments, Elzet bowed her head in agreement and said that although she was not eager, she would still cooperate with Kane. And together with him, they will sit on the tail of the Storm Guild. She looked at the emperor and added that, however, even if they found and killed the deposed prince, as long as Lady Pilgrim was the emperor's beloved, she would be threatened. She grabbed the door handle and, already on the way out of the room, said that he could not keep her near him forever. The door slammed, and he stood and looked at her, not daring to budge. His eyes lit up with a special sparkle every time Judith was mentioned. And now, alone with himself, he admitted that the marquise touched on too painful a topic. He leaned his elbows on the edge of the table, as if some kind of weight had fallen on his shoulders, and thought about what he knew from the very beginning. How selfish of him to tie Judith to himself because of a promise she made in early childhood that she doesn't even remember, and one night spent by mistake. His gaze became sad, but even though he knew it, he couldn't let her go. He remembered her words that he would no longer be lonely, she would become his family. And the ring is a confirmation of this promise. Little Judith held his hand, and smiling with an angelic smile, said that the ring she gave him was a sign that she would marry him. What is this? Dream? but the situation seems too familiar for sleep. There was a boy standing in front of her, and she named him Theodore, and he said that this was his name. Maid Marie pulled the blanket off her and said it was time to get up. Judith, being sleepy, did not fully understand what they wanted from her, and only slightly opened the corner of one eye and looked questioningly at the maid. And when the meaning finally dawned on her, she sat up on the bed and dangled her legs on the floor. Marie, meanwhile, asked why she slept for so long. She will soon be leaving for the Imperial Palace, and if she doesn't start getting ready this minute, she will be late. The girl hurried, and when she had already gotten ready and was ready to go on the front steps, her father stopped her, asking that she would go to the Imperial Palace today. Judith was already standing near the carriage and, turning to her father, said that she had promised His Majesty. And then she asked if something had happened. The Duke was extremely excited. He said that, to be honest, he had a disturbing dream last night. Therefore, he would like her to just stay at home today. But Judith gently objected that she would be in the Imperial Palace. What kind of danger could threaten her there? After all, His Majesty will also be nearby. But the Duke lost his temper. He said that she was saying such things, and then generally added, calling the Emperor a bastard, that he was the most dangerous in the world. Judith thought that things had finally calmed down lately, but her father turned on his organ again. The girl said that she couldn't break a promise without any special reason. She smiled at him encouragingly and said that she would have a bodyguard with her, so he didn't have to worry. The Duke was silent. And then, resignedly, he said that it seemed he was very worried and asked her to be careful on the way. Judith promised him that they would see each other at dinner. Theo, as always, was eagerly waiting for her at the palace, and when she finally arrived, he offered to snack on cookies. Judith sat with him at the table and suggested that we try something different today. She noticed that he always adapts to her tastes, but the Emperor said that today he also wants cookies. While the maid served them cookies and poured tea, he silently looked at her. And when she left, he said that he heard that Judith gave Elsette cookies that she made herself. Judith smiled. She confirmed that this was the case. Elsette was his closest relative, so she wanted to get along with her. But the Emperor noticeably frowned, and this did not escape Judith. She thought, what was wrong with him? What kind of reaction is this? He said that he also loves cookies. But the phrase flashed in her mind that he couldn't stand sweets. Her pupils dilated as if from a fiery flash. She froze and just looked at him silently. The girl thought, what was it? The Emperor turned to her, seeing that she was lost in thought. She took cookies from the plate and, smiling, apologized for thinking for a moment. And then she said that she would bake cookies for him, and now she invited him to enjoy what was on the table. She handed him a piece of the cookie, and Theo silently looked at him in bewilderment, as if not daring to take a bite. But the next moment he grabbed her wrist with his hand. It was so unexpected. Theo brought it to his lips, but didn't bite it right away. There was a silent pause. The image of the little boy in the red robe taking a bite of a cookie flashed through Judith's mind again, and the little one laughed and asked that it's delicious, isn't it? The girl was confused. She couldn't understand what was happening to her lately. Are these pictures really her memories? At that moment, the butler approached them, and apologizing for the disturbance, said that everything that His Majesty asked for was ready. Theo thanked him and said that he could go. He said her name and she shuddered. The Emperor said he wanted to show her something, so would she take a walk with him? They walked through the park. The sun was shining brightly, and Judith said that the days were so warm it looked like summer had fully come into its own. And he said that it was so. Judith stole a glance at Theo and wondered if he really wanted to show her the garden. Although she was a little nervous about what her father said this morning, Theo acted exactly the same as usual. Suddenly, a strong gust of wind ruffled the girl's hair, and she paused to straighten it. Theo caringly asked if she was okay, and Judith replied that the wind just suddenly blew. She didn't finish. Her gaze caught on something unexpectedly strange. She wanted to say that she was surprised, but when she saw the white flakes in front of her, she said in surprise that it was snow. The girl looked at how white petals were flying in the air, so much like snow. A gust of wind lifted them into the air, and they spun and settled on the ground. The girl caught one petal and said what it was, but didn't dare finish. Trees grew around the gazebo that was in front of them. They were cherry trees, and their branches were in full bloom. Judith froze in fascination. She couldn't believe her eyes. Theo stood behind her and watched her reaction and asked if she liked her. Judith turned to him and said in complete delight that it was so beautiful that she felt like she was sleeping. She asked in surprise how cherry trees could bloom at such a time. He replied that in the northern part of the empire, the trees had not yet bloomed, so he ordered several to be brought to the capital. When the flowers were about to bloom, all the magicians of the empire were mobilized. Judith said in surprise that why did you have to go so far? Theo touched her face, as if straightening a stray strand, and said that she herself said that she wanted this to be the day when the cherry blossoms would bloom. Judith looked at him, not understanding. Was all this really arranged especially for her? Theo looked at her. Hope glimmered in his eyes, and he said that now the cherry blossoms. And he stroked her cheek again and said that that's why. He asked her to get married again? Judith was silent. He said her name. Judith flushed. What kind of situation is this? Even if he wanted to get married as soon as possible, how could he do such madness? This defied any laws of common sense. Cherry blossoms bloomed around them, and there was a fabulous atmosphere, and the girl's heart beat the rhythm of happiness. Judith wrinkled the fabric of her skirt. Will she really have to walk down the aisle at this rate? Theo looked at her and was silent. He was waiting for an answer, but Judith didn't know what to tell him. She liked him very much, but he was waiting for a meeting with Serna. He said that he knew that she was avoiding him, the emperor. One look at her face is enough to understand this. Judith listened to him with lowered eyes, and he continued saying that the title of empress must be burdensome, because he has many enemies, many of whom will begin to persecute her, but he won't let anyone hurt her. He will do whatever she wants, and will make sure that anyone who threatens her cannot even set foot on the territory of the empire. He looked into her eyes and promised that he would make her an empress who would lead the most luxurious life in the history of the empire. He pulled out a cherry blossom petal from her hair and added that just being near him was enough for her. There was such despair on the emperor's face, as if his life depended on her answer, and he asked her to fulfill his request. Judith thought about how much she wanted to believe Theo, but she couldn't make up her mind. She looked into his amethyst eyes and thought that this ideal man, who was not afraid of anything, was extremely alarmed just because of what was about to come out of her mouth. There were tears in her eyes. The girl thought that how could such a situation not make her hesitate, but still, she apologized and said that she could not marry him. Theo felt as if the light had dimmed at her words, as if darkness had enveloped him. He asked why. Was he really just a one-night stand for her? Judith was silent. She really liked Theo, and she had a desire to stay by his side, but if Theo suddenly chose Serna, she would have to die. It was hard for Judith, too. She said that it wasn't that she didn't like him. She just thought he was in too much of a hurry. She added that he had previously said that he would adjust to her own rhythm. Judith asked to give her a little more time so that she could get to know him better. He sadly asked how long does she need, and she said that until the cherry trees really bloom. Theo asked what should he do if while he waits for her answer, she leaves him? His words surprised Judith, but he said that during their first meeting, she also ran away, leaving only a short note, and later she lied that she was a maid in the ducal house. Theo looked at Judith and asked why she was laughing. The girl really smiled with all her heart, but she still said that she just suddenly realized that she had gone too far. It turns out that he kept everything that happened in his heart, but Theo still remained sad, and then she said that there was one way that would make him forget about his anxiety. Judith asked if he wanted to listen. When Judith returned to the pilgrim residence, she immediately announced her engagement. This news excited the entire estate. My father couldn't believe she did it. Cain asked that she was by any chance threatened, and he added that if she had discussed all this with them, and Tuking immediately prepared to attack the imperial palace. But Judith, leaning her sides, thought that she knew that everything would be exactly like this. Her family is like little children, and so she said that she was the first to offer this to His Majesty, and he never threatened her. Cain and Tutsin listened to her attentively, and she continued by saying that His Majesty constantly postponed the question of marriage, so the nobles continued to pester him with proposals for marriage. But now that he has a fiancée, talk of marriage will subside for a while, and His Majesty himself will no longer rush into the wedding. And if you delay, then most likely the Emperor's interest in her will cool down, and then the engagement will not be broken. She hesitated and did not finish. This was unnecessary because her family rebelled again. The father jumped up and growled that he had said with such enthusiasm that he was ready to get married right now. Tutsin exclaimed that there is no man in this world who would reject Judith. Cain supported his father and asked what kind of divorce. In the end, Tuking said that even a fool could understand that as long as they were engaged, the emperor would become even more obsessed with her. Cain looked searchingly at his brother, and he asked why he was looking at him. But Cain just flew at him, wanting to give him a beating. Tuzin dodged and asked what came over him. Meanwhile, Judith began to think that when she is with them, her self-esteem skyrockets. But Theo's feelings may really change if the story follows the original. There are 3 months left until the Harvest Festival, when the original plot begins, and she so wanted this day to come as soon as possible. Although, it would be even better if he had never come at all. Her heart was torn by complex feelings. The emperor convened a meeting. He announced that in 2 weeks his engagement to Lady Pilgrim would take place, and asked if anyone had any objections. The ministers silently accepted this information, although everyone thought that the candidate for the place of the empress is usually presented to His Majesty after the Council of Nobles chooses the candidate. But His Majesty himself made the decision, and the choice fell on the daughter of the ducal house. Attention was focused on Duke Fergra, and he himself was not at all delighted with this statement. He remembered his daughter and her words that since the decision had already been made, the engagement would not be cancelled. He was stifled by anger, and he was holding back. He told Judith that he respected her opinion, so he couldn't just turn everything around. And he was also terribly annoyed that in this way the emperor warned that objections would not be accepted. The emperor concluded that since there were no objections, we could move on to the next point regarding preparations for the engagement. The ministers left the hall, and a discussion began between them in the corridor. Someone said that it was an exciting meeting, and he added that he would never have thought that His Majesty would make such a loud statement, and his partner agreed with him. Someone behind the Duke shouted congratulations to him, but the Duke immediately pulled back the Marquis of Eston who was speaking. But then he said that the Duke refused the marriage of his daughter with his son Caleb, and asked that he really planned from the very beginning to make his daughter empress. It seemed like a trifle, but the Duke was boiling with anger inside. He just wanted to scream that his Judith was 1,000,000 times more valuable than this insignificant emperor. The Duke turned to him and said that it seemed the Marquis had misunderstood something. Even if it were not for the emperor, he still would not have married his daughter to Caleb. This was a slap in the face of the Marquis's pride, and he roared for the Duke to explain what he said.